no inheritance, only obedience. Imagine being born into a world where your destiny is decided not by your choices, not by your ambition, not even by your character, but by the order in which you enter the world. You're the second son, the one who arrives just minutes, hours, or a year after your elder brother. In the medieval world, that accident of timing would dictate the rest of your life. Your brother inherits everything: the family land, the ancestral home, the wealth, the power, even the right to use your own surname as a mark of authority. You inherit nothing except a quiet command to obey him forever. This wasn't just custom. This was the law of primogeniture, a system so rigid it would bend the fate of thousands, crush hope, and ignite sibling rivalries that could topple kingdoms. The firstborn son is treated as a living vessel of legacy. From birth he's praised, tutored, shaped into a future lord. Every family's dreams and ambitions are poured into him, because, legally and culturally, he will become the father, the lord, the king of the next generation. The second son watches this ritual from the shadows. His cradle is quieter. His tutors are second-hand. His future, deliberately left blank. By law, when the father dies, everything, every inch of soil, every coin, every title, passes to the eldest, even if that son is a fool, a tyrant, or a child. The rest of the family must bow, literally and emotionally, to his rule. You might ask, why? The answer is harsh but simple. Divided land is weakened land. Medieval rulers, obsessed with power and legacy, believed that splitting property among multiple sons would fracture estates, invite infighting, and erode the family's strength. Unity under one heir was supposed to keep families powerful, loyal, and unbroken, but beneath this surface, logic is a tragedy of epic scale, the slow erasure of everyone except the firstborn. For the second son, the script is set before he can speak. He might be sent to the church, forced into a monastery, or told to join the army. He may end up managing his brother's affairs, a glorified servant for the rest of his life, hoping for scraps, a pension, a small plot of land, or even just permission to marry. Some families try to soften the blow with a token inheritance, a minor title, or a distant estate, but these gestures often came with their own chains, relentless obligations to the elder brother, and the unspoken threat of exile if loyalty ever wavered. Stories from history are filled with the silent suffering and sometimes explosive rebellion of these forgotten sons. In 12th century England, Geoffrey Plantagenet, the second son of Henry II, spent his life at war with his older brother Richard, known as the Lionheart. The Plantagenet family, like many royal dynasties, became a battleground of envy, resentment, and desperation, as each brother vied for a sliver of the father's favor and fortune. More often, though, the struggle was invisible, a slow internal suffocation where every hope was replaced with duty and every ambition was quietly buried. Sometimes the second son was forced into obedient invisibility. He would manage the family books, run errands, handle disputes, but could never sign his own name to an order. Even his voice was measured. He might be older in mind, stronger in spirit, or more capable than his brother, but the law didn't care. Only the firstborn mattered. There are records from France, Spain, and the German principalities of second sons who, after years of service, were simply cut off, banished for disobedience, accused of betrayal, or pushed into poverty if they refused to submit. In England, entire poems and folk tales were written about the fate of the younger brother, always depicted as clever but unlucky, loyal but doomed. In noble families, some younger sons tried to carve their own path. They became knights errant, mercenaries, or explorers, risking everything for a taste of glory that inheritance denied them. Many joined the Crusades, where dying far from home was often seen as preferable to living as a servant under your own roof. Others entered the church, where they could rise in power, if only by abandoning their name, their claim, their family ties. Some even turned to crime or rebellion, allying with rivals or fueling peasant uprisings, desperate to escape the shadow of a law that saw them as expendable. But perhaps the cruelest fate was reserved for those who stayed, who obeyed, who tried to earn a place by the elder brother's side. There are letters from the 15th century in which second sons beg for recognition, for land, for a purpose. One English noble wrote to his brother, "I am as a ghost in your house, alive but unseen." His plea was ignored. The story repeated itself in estate after estate, generation after generation. Even in death, the hierarchy persisted. Family tombs would place the firstborn's effigy in the center, grand and crowned, while the others were pushed to the sides or left out entirely. Yet, sometimes, the system backfired. A firstborn might die young or in battle, and suddenly the second son became heir, but not before years of humiliation and neglect had shaped his character. Some of the most ruthless rulers in history were accidental heirs, hardened by years of enforced obedience. Their reigns were marked by both innovation and cruelty, a testament to the psychological damage wrought by a lifetime spent as an afterthought. Even in modern times, the echoes of this system linger. The phrase second fiddle still haunts our language. Families all over the world, consciously or not, mimic the logic of primogeniture. One child is chosen to succeed. The others are expected to step back, to help, to obey. The consequences can be lifelong, a kind of learned helplessness, a resentment that breathes distance, a family story shaped more by absence than presence. This is the hidden cost of obedience by inheritance, the loss of potential, the silencing of talent, the narrowing of human possibility to a single bloodline, a single name. For every famous firstborn in the history books, there are countless others whose stories were never written, whose dreams were never spoken, because the world told them, your only inheritance is obedience. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy of all. In the quiet corridors of history, you can still hear the footsteps of those younger sons pacing in the dark, always waiting, always watching, never allowed to lead, always commanded to follow. Their lives are reminders that sometimes the greatest injustice is not what's taken from you, but what you are never permitted to seek. So next time you read about great houses and noble lines, remember, every grand legacy is built on invisible sacrifices. For every name we remember, there are 100 we forget. Brothers in the shadows, forced to trade their birthright for silence, their futures for loyalty, their destinies for the fleeting comfort of belonging. This is the true unspoken legacy of inheritance by obedience, a world where birth order writes your fate, and only the eldest may ever hope to break free. The church or the sword, no choice at all. Imagine a world where your life is decided long before your first memory. The day you are born as a second son into a noble medieval family, your fate is sealed, not by your heart's desires, but by an ancient contract inked in blood and law. In the grand tapestry of European feudalism, the firstborn son is the axis, the heir to land, title, and legacy. Every inch of soil, every coin, every serf, every secret. And you, the second son, become a question to which the family already has two answers, the church or the sword. From the very beginning, choice is a fantasy. By the age of 7, you are already being shaped like wet clay, but not into a person, into a solution for the family's surplus. Tutors and priests probe your mind, searching for signs of piety or valor, but it hardly matters. The destiny of the second son is not drawn from character or calling, but from calculation. A noble's first priority is the preservation of property and reputation, and every additional son is either an asset or a risk. Too many sons means the northward divided land, feuding siblings, and weakened dynasties. The answer? Funnel the excess into lifelong servitude to God or king. By the age of 12, childhood is over, and the fork in the road appears. You are handed over to the monastery or the barracks, never asked if you wish to pray or bleed, only expected to obey. In reality, it is no choice at all, because refusing both is to commit a kind of treason, betrayal of your bloodline, your ancestors, your entire world. Disobedience is not an option. If you resist, you risk exile, disgrace, or worse, being disinherited, erased, made a warning to others. For those sent to the church, the transition is abrupt and absolute. A second son, destined for the monastery, is sheared of his family identity and handed over to monks who demand silence, discipline, and endless hours of prayer. The monastery is not a sanctuary of peace, but a fortress of obedience. The boy's hair is shorn, his clothes replaced with scratchy wool, his days measured in bells, his future mapped in scripture and self-denial. He learns to fear sin more than pain, to hunger for salvation more than freedom. Some learn to accept this life, convincing themselves that piety is purpose. Many do not. There are stories, real haunting stories, of second sons weeping alone at night, composing letters home that would never be sent, cursing the fate that had made them both invisible and inescapable. Others are handed a sword, their path set by violence instead of vows. The second sons made knights become expendable shields for their family's interests. They are sent to distant courts as squires, their loyalty bought with a promise of glory that is, in truth, for someone else's benefit. These boys are trained to kill and die for men whose names will echo in history, while their own stories dissolve into the background noise of war. There is little time for self-discovery, just the endless drill of discipline, the sting of bruises, the humiliation of failure, and the bitter realization that survival depends not on greatness, but on being useful. Whispers survive in chronicles and letters, glimpses of those who try to defy this forced destiny. A young man who fled the abbey by night, only to be hunted down and dragged back in chains. A squire who deserted the field, declared a traitor, his family forced to disavow his name. Most such rebels vanished from the record, absorbed by the silence of shame. For every story of defiance, a dozen more ended in quiet submission. The machinery of inheritance law was unyielding, and society conspired to enforce it. Families who indulged rebellious second sons were seen as weak, unworthy of land, of trust, of survival itself. There is a dark genius to the system. For the ruling class, it was the ultimate social engineering. Ensure that every resource is concentrated, every threat neutralized. The eldest son becomes lord and master. The second is sacrifice for the sake of order, whether in the shadowed halls of the abbey or the mud-soaked fields of battle. But the cost was enormous, measured not just in ruined lives, but in the culture of quiet suffering that haunted the noble class for centuries. Even the idea of vocation, the divine calling to a holy or martial life, became twisted. The church welcomed the flood of second sons, but they knew the truth. Letters between bishops reveal a cynical undertone. Many young novices arrive with bitterness in their hearts, reciting prayers they did not believe, longing for freedoms they would never know. Some monasteries became sanctuaries for broken spirits. Others little more than prisons, holding men who had committed no crime except being born second. And so, across the map of medieval Europe, a generation of unwilling monks and reluctant knights formed a shadow society. They filled libraries with anonymous manuscripts, built stone churches whose walls could never tell their secrets, died nameless deaths on distant frontiers. Some found meaning in their forced path, transforming pain into piety, or skill at arms into reluctant heroism. But many simply faded into obscurity, their stories reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. The consequences rippled outward, distorting family relationships and creating a culture of suspicion, jealousy, and suppressed anger. Brothers who might have been allies became rivals or strangers. Parents learned to love conditionally, proud of the heir, resigned to the sacrifice of the second, and those who endured it year after year carried their bitterness like an unhealed wound. In rare, searing moments, that pain surfaced. A monk who wrote scathing sermons about the cruelty of inheritance law, a knight who refused to kneel to his older brother, choosing exile over humiliation, a poet writing in secret, whose verses mocked the very system that fed him. Yet, this world of forced destinies was not truly ancient. It was the product of human fear, the fear of divided power, the terror of uncertainty, the need to bind every family member to a role, no matter how unnatural. Over time, new laws and revolutions began to crack the system, granting younger sons opportunities in law, trade, and adventure far from home. But for hundreds of years, there was no such hope. The church or the sword, no choice at all. So when you imagine the grand cathedrals and legendary knights of medieval Europe, remember those who never had the chance to choose. Their silent obedience built the world's greatest fortunes and filled its darkest corners with regret. History remembers the firstborn, but it was the second sons, unwilling monks, forgotten knights, anonymous laborers who bore the burden of survival, whose lives were spent holding up the very order that erased their names. And in every echoing cloister and blood-soaked battlefield, you can still feel the weight of choices never given, destinies never questioned, and voices that, for centuries, were never allowed to speak. The brother who was sent to war as bait. Picture a bleak dawn in the year 1178. Rain falls hard on churned earth as armored men assemble in a wasted field, mist thick as sorrow. No bard will remember this day. No chronicler will bother to record the names of most who fight here. Yet, in this mud, a single decision, conceived in the dim, cold corridors of a noble house, will shape the fates of two brothers and echo the brutal mathematics of inheritance and expendability that defined medieval Europe. This is a story of a second son, known to his kin as nothing more than the younger. He was not raised for greatness. He was not groomed for lordship. For the moment of his birth, his future was written in absence. No title, no land, no secure position, just a long shadow cast by his elder brother. In noble families, the law of primogeniture reigned with an iron logic. The firstborn son would inherit everything, while the younger siblings, especially the second son, were left as bargaining chips, disposable assets, or, as in this story, living sacrifices for a family's fragile survival. In the 12th century, a feud could begin over a single word or a glance at a council table. Houses clashed over borders, dowries, even pride, and when words failed, violence followed, a swift and bloody calculus. This was a time when peace was negotiated not only with words and seals, but with living hostages, with public acts of obedience, with calculated gestures of loyalty and threat. In this world, The life of a second son was often a currency. Our unnamed brother grew up under the strict gaze of a mother obsessed with appearances and a father who spoke only of duty, never love. He watched as his older brother was trained in diplomacy, falconry, the art of hosting, skills meant for a lord. The younger was taught how to endure, how to obey, and, when needed, how to bleed without complaint. From his earliest years, he learned that every privilege could be revoked, every affection withdrawn, should he ever threaten the position of the heir. Then the feud began. A rival house, emboldened by shifting alliances and a disputed tract of land, made a series of humiliating raids. The family standing was at stake, and the tension within the hall was palpable. Lords, priests, and mercenaries arguing strategy while servants listened, faces blank with fear. It was in this atmosphere, thick with suspicion and dread, that a plan emerged. Send the second son as the visible face of honor on the front line. He would command a detachment at the very edge of the coming battle, displaying the house's courage and sacrifice for all to see. In reality, he was bait, a signal to the rival lord that the family was committed to war, while the true negotiations were held elsewhere, in secret. The older brother, the heir, would remain safely behind the lines, far from arrow shot or blade, shielded by a ring of loyal men and a dozen plausible excuses. If things went badly, the family could mourn a brave loss and continue talks. If things went well, the second son might earn a brief mention in a letter, nothing more. Either way, he was expendable. A pawn moved forward to preserve the king. On the morning of the battle, the second son's armor was ill-fitted and cold. He led men who barely knew his name. Some had debts to his family. Some had simply been pressed into service from the nearest village. None would write songs for these soldiers. They advanced through a slurry of mud and blood, the only certainty the knowledge that their deaths would buy their lord's time. As the arrows fell and swords clashed, the second son fought with a kind of desperate clarity, knowing each moment could be his last, yet refusing to flee. Medieval chronicles rarely describe the terror of these moments, the deafening clang of metal, the stench of churned soil and bodies, the agony of wounds that would fester in hours. Yet these were the realities for thousands of forgotten men, sent to die for causes they neither chose nor understood. As the tide turned and a small force was cut down, the second son was struck in the thigh, then the shoulder, then finally fell face first into the mud, his breathing drowned by earth and rain. There was no glory, there was no rescue. The survivors would later say that he fought bravely, but their words carried little weight. By dusk, his body was already stripped of armor, his face indistinguishable in the churned field, a nameless casualty in a nameless feud. Back at the manor, word of his death arrived not with trumpets or banners, but as a whispered report to the steward. His mother wept behind closed doors. His father barely paused before returning to his calculations. The older brother, who survived to become lord, who would one day tell his own sons tales of loyalty and sacrifice, ensure that the family name survived. But in the official chronicle, the second son's name was omitted entirely. In one passage, he is described only as a brave youth, recently departed. This was not an anomaly. Across Europe, from Normandy to Saxony, countless second sons vanished from the record, sent as tokens of peace, hostages, or front-line commanders in battles not meant to be won. In England's endless wars against France, in the internecine conflicts of Italy's city-states, in the skirmishes of the Holy Roman Empire, second sons were frequently offered as proof of a family's resolve. Medieval letters and legal documents are filled with references to the younger brother or the spare, but rarely with a name, rarely with a story. Why did families do this? The brutal answer is survival. In a society obsessed with bloodlines and continuity, the firstborn was everything. Without a clear heir, estates could be lost, titles forfeit, the family thrown into chaos. Younger sons were a liability, potential rivals, possible traitors, or just inconvenient reminders that life was not fair. Sending them to war was a way to prove loyalty, buy time, or, when necessary, quietly remove a source of tension. But these sacrifices left deep scars, not only on the battlefield, but within the surviving family. Noble houses lived in perpetual fear of losing the heir, of having to replace him with a lesser son, of being shamed for not showing enough honor in public displays of risk. Families who failed to offer up sons were accused of cowardice or disloyalty, charges that could lead to the loss of alliances, land, or even lives. And for the second sons themselves, their fate was sealed before they could speak. Some rebelled, fleeing to distant lands to carve out new identities as mercenaries, pirates, or monks. Others tried to gain power by marrying well, seeking fortunes in the Crusades, or gambling on royal favor. But the vast majority simply did as they were told, walking into battle with empty promises in their hearts, believing perhaps that a single act of bravery might finally win them a name in their father's eyes. It almost never did. Their sacrifice was expected, their death a footnote. Even the act of mourning was rationed. Too much grief for a second son might be seen as weakness, too little as cold-hearted calculation. In rare moments, a second son's death inspired genuine remorse. Letters survive from mothers who never recovered from the loss, from younger siblings who quietly lit candles in memory of a brother the world preferred to forget. But most often, history marched on, indifferent and unblinking. The house survived, the title passed, the firstborn inherited, as always, and the second son, who died as bait in a pointless feud, vanished into the mud, his memory lost to time, his sacrifice repurposed as a lesson for those who followed. In this world, some lives are meant only to be spent. Yet, listen carefully to the whispers beneath the surface of the chronicles, the unnamed, the unsung, the expendable. Their stories, once erased, now return as shadows across the landscape of history, reminding us that every page written in glory rests on 100 unmarked graves. The brother who was sent to war as bait did not die for honor, or for family, or for any cause he chose. He died because the world of the 12th century demanded that someone else's future always came first, and so the chronicles are silent. The mud remembers. The lesson lingers. In the cold logic of inheritance, it was never about who lived bravely, but about who was allowed to live at all. Used as political pawns in marriage, you were not born for yourself. If you were a second son in a noble house during the tangled centuries of medieval Europe, you entered the world as a piece in someone else's game. From the moment you drew breath, your life was charted on a map of alliances, ambitions, and bloodlines. Your elder brother, the firstborn, inherited the lands, the titles, the birthright. His path was set: marry for gold, for power, for dynasty. He was the pillar, the legacy bearer. But you, second, sometimes third, sometimes fifth, were given a different destiny. You became a living key, a bargaining chip, a diplomatic offering, the one who would seal peace, secure debts, or open doors to distant courts. In the grand cold calculus of medieval marriage, eldest sons were reserved for heiresses. those young women whose dowries could double a family's power or unlock new territories. Theirs were the grand weddings, silk and banners, alliances made in cathedrals and celebrated with feasts that lasted days. But for you, the second son, there was no such fairy tale. Your marriage was never about desire, barely even about your own house. It was a transaction, sometimes a desperate one. Your fate was decided in council chambers, over letters written in cipher, in secret meetings between anxious lords and cunning bishops. You might be sent to a remote border, married off to a distant cousin, a widow perhaps, who was past childbearing, but whose lands were strategically perched between rival duchies. Sometimes you were offered to a foreign court, to a princess who didn't speak your language, whose customs were strange, whose loyalty to her father's throne would always outweigh any bond to you. Sometimes you were given to a noblewoman whose own value was not her beauty, but her barren womb, a woman whose family needed ties, not heirs, a political favor wrapped in a velvet dress. You might be older than her, or much younger, or not even know her face, until the day of the vows. There were marriages where the bride wore black in mourning for her last husband, or where the entire arrangement was little more than a truce between ancient enemies, both sides gambling that time, if not love, would heal old wounds. These were unions built on necessity. They often carried the chill of strategy more than the warmth of home. Your bride might see you as an intruder, a steward, or simply a means to an end. You, in turn, might view her as a fortress, a lock you had to keep, or a ghost of promises made between fathers. There are letters, faded and hidden in archives from such men. Second sons forced to build their lives around a single calculated promise. Some wrote of the loneliness of being surrounded by servants in strange castles, of learning new dialects, of sleeping beside a stranger every night and never quite touching her heart. Some wrote of quiet resentment, of knowing their own ambitions were buried under obligation, sin as they never chose. Others found pride in the work, the delicate dance of holding peace on the border, the careful stewardship of lands won not by war, but by the cold mercy of marriage. You became a mediator, a hostage in velvet, a peacekeeper whose very presence was a reminder that the world could only be stitched together with human lives. You learned the value of silence, of patience, of nodding at the right moments. Sometimes you found your own power, a clever second son who earned respect in a new land, who turned exile into opportunity, who raised a banner of his own. But often you became invisible, a branch on the family tree, referenced in genealogies and treaties, forgotten in legend. The courts and kings who brokered these matches knew what they were doing. Every union, every dowry, every whispered promise in a cold stone hall was a thread in a wider tapestry. These marriages were shields against war, bribes for loyalty, insurance policies written in human flesh. Second sons became the currency of the realm. Their happiness was rarely considered. What mattered was the network of blood and fealty that could keep kingdoms intact, or at least delay the next war. Sometimes your new home was hostile, your in-laws suspicious, your wife bitter over a lifetime of lost choices. In those years, loneliness was your only inheritance. Sometimes you were honored if you proved useful, if you could keep your wife's lands from being swallowed by hungry neighbors, if you could produce a single tenuous heir, if you could navigate the politics of two families and never once falter. A few second sons turned these marriages to their advantage, amassing quiet fortunes, rising through loyalty, becoming counselors or trusted intermediaries in the great games of Europe, but the many faded into the background, living lives of constant negotiation, always aware that their value was measured not in love, nor even in blood, but in the alliances they embodied. History is filled with the shadows of these men, brothers to kings, uncles to heirs, strangers in their own homes. Some found the comfort in friendship or in the arms of lovers discreetly kept. Some rebelled, fleeing their appointed fates, sparking wars or scandals that rippled through generations. Some accepted their place, carrying the burden of duty quietly, their names recorded only in the margins of treaties, the corners of stained glass windows, the dusty registries of land holdings. You might see it as tragedy or as quiet heroism. To be a pawn is to be moved, sometimes sacrificed, sometimes transformed by circumstance. But behind every alliance, every century of uneasy peace, every kingdom that endured just a little longer, is the story of a second son, married, not for himself, but for the ambitions of those who raised him. The next time you walk through a crumbling castle or read the name of a nobleman whose title is followed by of somewhere else, remember this: for every grand finity alliance, for every war that didn't happen, for every fleeting piece in the long tapestry of history, there was a man who learned to make a life out of the space between two families, who found meaning, if only sometimes, in duty, in patience, and in the faint hope that somewhere his own story might be remembered too. The second son who became a monk and a spy. Imagine being born into nobility, but knowing from your very first days that your life is not your own. In the world of medieval Europe, primogeniture ruled. Firstborn sons inherited the estate, the title, the future. Second sons, by contrast, were destined to serve family strategy. In some rare cases, this meant more than just a quiet life in a monastery. Sometimes it meant becoming a pawn in a game of faith and power, an unwilling monk, and, stranger still, a silent spy. The fate of one such young noble, a second son born in the shadow of his elder brother, unfolds like a story that history prefers to whisper, not shout. He was sent away as a child, before he could truly know the stone corridors of his family's estate. For second sons, the monastic path was rarely a calling. It was a sentence. The church was a dumping ground for those not needed in the line of succession, a place where the ambitions of a noble house could be managed at arm's length. It was not about piety. It was about control, and for some families it became a double-edged sword, because the church was a place where secrets collected like dust, and where dangerous new ideas, heresies, could spread unchecked. As a boy, he struggled to find the purpose among men who whispered prayers by candlelight and spent hours in silent contemplation. The monastery was not the refuge it appeared to be from the outside. Monks schemed, fought for influence, and even formed hidden alliances with local lords or rival abbeys. But for a second son like him, there was no escape. His family watched from afar, sending letters and envoys, reminding him again and again that he owed everything to them, and that even as a man of God, he would be their eyes and ears in the church. The 12th and 13th centuries were an age of anxiety for the church. Heresy was not just a word. It was a disease feared by both kings and popes. The Cathars, the Waldensians, and countless smaller sects threatened to undermine the authority of Rome. Monasteries, supposedly fortresses of orthodoxy, sometimes became breeding grounds for forbidden ideas. Local nobles, hoping to weaken rivals or curry favor with the church, would quietly plant trusted family members in abbeys across the land. And so, our second son became a tool, a priest by robe, a spy by command. He was told to listen, to confess, to observe which monks met in shadowed corners, who avoided the Mass, who owned forbidden books. He kept detailed notes, sometimes hiding them in the bindings of ancient texts, or passing them secretly to writers loyal to his house. His abbot, stern and suspicious, noticed the young monk's keen eye and gave him more responsibility, ironically making his work as a spy even easier. He learned to blend the role of confessor with that of informer, extracting secrets in the name of God, but reporting them to his family, and, at times, to secular authorities who could be trusted or bought. There are records, scattered and incomplete, of such second sons who were used in this way. Some of their stories come down to us in the margin, notes of chronicles, in letters sent to bishops or lords, or in the confessions of dying monks who feared for their souls. The life was one of the deep loneliness. In the cloister, he was neither fully brother nor fully priest. He was always the outsider, the man whose gaze lingered too long, whose prayers seemed just a little too careful. The danger was not imaginary. Inquisitors sometimes arrived with no warning, scouring the abbey for signs of heresy or treachery. Even a hint of double dealing could mean torture, exile, or death. And yet, for his family, the risk was part of the bargain. If he succeeded, he brought back valuable information about rival houses, about the church politics, about the mood of the land. If he failed, he was a disposable loss. After all, he was not the heir. Sometimes he was asked to do worse than spy. On more than one occasion, he was told to spread rumors, to plant letters, to nudge the abbey's suspicions in the direction of a rival or an enemy. The line between piety and treachery blurred until he could no longer tell if he was serving God, family, or simply the cold needs of power. He watched as older monks, men who truly believed in the sacred mission of their order, were quietly removed or denounced, sometimes on the basis of evidence he himself had been forced to provide. Inside, the second son became a man divided. Outwardly, he wore the simple robe, took the vows, and sang the psalms. Inwardly, he struggled with guilt, with doubt, with the realization that he had been crafted into a weapon since childhood. He saw the way the monastery shaped souls, the way isolation, fasting, and penance could make a man break, or turn him into something cold and cunning. There were nights he dreamed of escape, of slipping away to a distant priory, of abandoning his family and forging his own fate. But always the threat hung over him. A letter, a messenger, a summons from the abbot. He was watched as closely as he watched others. His story is not unique. Across Europe, the church became a battlefield for families and for factions, each seeking to install their own blood as bishops, abbots, priors, and yes, spies. Some became cardinals, even popes. Others vanished into the shadows, their names erased from the family records when they failed or fell from favor. The second son lived in a world where loyalty was a currency, and where the price of disobedience was paid in exile, silence, or death. Imagine the psychological cost of such a life. Every act of worship is tinged with secrecy. Every act of penance is also a cover for betrayal. When he knelt in the chapel, was he praying for his soul or for the survival of his house? When he wrote his family, was he confessing sins or calculating the next move in a chess game that spanned continents and centuries? Medieval history is filled with such stories, where individuals became mechanisms for larger forces, where even the sacred was profaned in the pursuit of power. The second son, who became a monk and a spy, stands as a chilling reminder. In the world of dynasties, inheritance, and faith, nothing was sacred. not even the soul. This is not just the story of one man, but of an entire class of people, second sons, forced into obedience, weaponized by family ambition, and cast into the shadows of the very institutions meant to offer peace. His life, recorded in fragments and whispers, remains a testament to the hidden costs of history, the private betrayals, the secret lives, and the silent suffering that shape the destinies of nations from within cloistered walls. The brother who was ordered to die in his elder's place, in the silent corridors of power, where the legacy of a family meant more than truth, there lived a code that demanded obedience beyond death. Imagine a grand chateau in 17th century France, a world divided by hierarchy, scandal, and the unsparing logic of inheritance. Here, the firstborn son was the hope of the house, the name-bearer, the future lord. The second son, his fate was decided by birth, his role defined by obedience. But sometimes that obedience would demand the ultimate sacrifice. Picture a night where thunder rattles the tapestries and the servants whisper in the hallways. The eldest son, heir to title and land, is wanted by the king's men, his crime unspeakable, his capture inevitable. But to lose the heir would mean the ruin of everything. The extinction of a family line, the collapse of centuries of privilege. Panic spreads through the household. The father trembles, the mother weeps, but it is the second son who is summoned. He is not asked, he is told. You will take your brother's place, they say. You will wear his coat, answer to his name, confess to his crime. For the good of the house, for the name, for us all, the second son knows what this means, but centuries of expectation weigh on his shoulders. He has been trained from birth to obey, to submit, to be useful, never to outshine, never to refuse. So, in the dark, he is dressed in his brother's clothes. His hair is cut to match. He is taught the right signature, the right manner of speech. The loyal servants close their eyes. The priest says nothing. The mother blesses him, but it is a blessing twisted by duty. They lead him, trembling, through a hidden passage, out into the custody of the king's soldiers. The records preserved in the fragments in French archives tell only part of the story. A nobleman is arrested, confesses, and is executed by sword in a grim square. The city watches, believing they are witnessing justice. But the name recorded is not the name of the man who dies. The family never protests. The church does not speak. Even as his body is lowered into an unmarked grave, no one whispers the truth. The world believes the line is safe, the heir punished, the scandal ended. But for the second son, it is the final chapter in a lifetime of self-erasure. He has spent his years shadowing his brother, watching him ride, fight, feast, and fail, always the audience, never the actor. When the day came for courage, he offered his life, not for glory, but for silence. He dies as someone else, erased from history twice, once by law, once by love warped into obedience. The story does not end with his death. The elder brother, spared and hidden, lives on. The family's secret becomes an heirloom, a debt that can never be repaid. In later years, the surviving brother may rise to new power, marry, have sons of his own, but at every feast, in every prayer, there is a ghost at the table. Some say the firstborns who survived in this way were haunted ever after, unable to look their children in the eye, cursed to remember the price of their fortune. Across Europe, stories like these echo in hushed tones. Sometimes the roles are reversed. A younger brother framed, a cousin sacrificed, a loyal servant forced to sign a false confession. But always, at the root, is the same brutal machinery, a world where obedience to family, to legacy, to name outweighs justice, mercy, or truth. The individual becomes fuel for the survival of the house. Suffering is sanctified if it keeps the family strong. Think about what this means for the second son. He was not simply a victim. He was a product of a system designed to erase individuality. From his first steps, he learned to measure his worth in loyalty, not in dreams. He internalized the logic that his life, and even his death, belonged to the needs of the family. It's not hard to imagine the moment before his execution, when he might have wondered if anyone would remember the truth, or if his entire existence would dissolve into the lie. Some historians argue that these sacrifices, these silent martyrdoms, were the secret glue of noble society. Without them, scandals would have destroyed dynasties, but what is left behind is a grave with no name, a story untold, a brother who was not just ordered to die, but ordered to die as someone else. Even in official records, his identity was never corrected. The family moved forward, their honor preserved, their shame buried with the body of the obedient son. Such stories are not just relics of a cruel past. The logic survives in subtler forms. Families who pressure children to take the blame, to hide the truth, to suffer so that others might thrive. We inherit not only land or title, but the burden of these ancient bargains. The idea that sometimes survival demands the sacrifice of the silent. So when you look at the portraits of noble families, rows of confident heirs, gleaming coats of arms, and lines of perfect descent, remember what those images don't show. Behind every lineage is a shadow, and sometimes a sacrifice so complete that even the truth could not survive. The brother who died in his elder's place was not just a casualty of fate. He was a casualty of a world that worshipped obedience above all else, and demanded that some lives be lived and ended as a lie. In every grand house that survived the fires of history, in every dynasty that continued unbroken, you will find, if you look closely enough, a ghost story. It is the story of a brother who answered to another's name, walked to another's death, and vanished so that the world could keep believing in order, in legacy, in the fiction of justice. His silence echoes through time, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest crimes are the ones a family agrees to never confess, the forgotten ones in family portraits. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval hall, every wall tells a story. These are not stories written in words, but woven into tapestry and painted across aged wood. Grand portraits, gilded frames, and intricate genealogical trees that record the glory of a family. Look closer, and you will see a powerful illusion, an act of historical magic. These images tell you who mattered, and just as powerfully, who did not. For every lord seated in the center, every golden-haired heir holding a sword or scroll, there are shadows, blurred faces, and nameless silhouettes occupying the corners, lingering at the edge of memory. These are the forgotten ones, the second sons whose lives were written out before they began. Imagine a time when a family's entire legacy depended on a single line. An unbroken chain of firstborn sons, meticulously documented in scrolls, paintings, and wall hangings. To be visible in art was to exist. To be named was to be real. The family portrait was a declaration of power, ownership, and destiny. But these masterpieces, woven and painted at enormous cost, were never just records. They were arguments, propaganda, crafted to convince all who saw them that the bloodline was stable, unbroken, singular. There could be no ambiguity, no threat to inheritance, no inconvenient reminders that younger sons, too, had ambitions and blood and dreams. And so, many second sons vanished from the very artifacts that defined family and memory. In tapestries, they might appear as a single, anonymous figure, Frater Minor, the younger brother, without name, title, or any distinguishing feature. Sometimes they were depicted as children forever, locked in the background, holding books or dogs, denied the dignity of adulthood. Other times, their image was omitted entirely. In painted genealogies, a single flourishing branch would split from the family trunk, proudly bearing the name and achievements of the firstborn, while smaller offshoots curled into empty scrolls or faded into decorative vines. You could search for hours and never find them, because they were never meant to be found. This erasure was not a simple accident. It was a deliberate act, shaped by law and necessity. In a world governed by primogeniture, the rule that only the eldest son inherits, it was dangerous to acknowledge the ambitions or existence of second sons. Their presence in the family record threatened to undermine the illusion of perfect succession. Families feared that a named and pictured younger son might one day lay claim to land, title, or authority. It was far safer to blur him into the background, to let him exist only as a suggestion, an afterthought. But what does this erasure mean for the human beings behind the brushstrokes and threads? Imagine being born into a world of tapestries that you can see but never truly enter. You eat at the table, you pray in the chapel, you fight in your father's wars, but when the painter arrives, you become invisible. Even as your brother's face is captured in oils and your sister's wedding is immortalized in colored silk, you are reduced to a footnote, or worse, a faceless ornament on the edge of the frame. This was not just an aesthetic choice, but a sentence to a life without recognition. A second son might rise to become a scholar, a knight, even a bishop, but his achievements rarely found their way back into the family's official memory. Entire generations lived and died with only a single mention. Our younger brother, lost at Acre, or sent to serve at the abbey. If they married well, their children might be restored to the tree. If they did not, they faded into oblivion. In the rare cases where a family did record all its children, the contrast is startling. The firstborn's portrait is rendered with meticulous care. Every detail of their face, their clothing, their symbols of power. The younger sons are painted smaller, often grouped together, sharing a single label. In some works, the faces are intentionally generic, repeated features, ambiguous ages, indistinguishable from each other. One chronicler wrote of a noble family's grand tapestry. The eldest is like a king, the second is as a shadow. Even in death, second sons might receive no mention on tombs or memorials, their names lost while the family line pressed ever forward. This selective memory served a purpose beyond the household. To neighboring nobles, to the church, to potential allies and enemies, the portrait on the wall was a message. Our line is strong, united, without rivals. There are no splinter branches, no threats from within. The fewer faces in the painting, the less chance of challenge or dispute. And so, the erasure of second sons became a kind of silent law, enforced not by violence, but by omission, by the cold brush of an artist and the sharp eye of a steward. Yet, the reality beneath this illusion was never so tidy. Family letters, court records, and private diaries reveal the undercurrent of longing, jealousy, and resentment. Second sons petitioned for recognition, sought commissions in far-off lands, sometimes conspired against their brothers. A few dared to commission their own portraits, private acts of defiance, hidden away from the public gaze. A handful of tapestries survive with subtle signs of resistance, a small figure, and holding a personal emblem, eyes turned not to the patriarch, but to the viewer, pleading silently to be remembered. For many, there was no such solace. Their stories survive only in the negative space of history, in the absence of a name, the blank scroll on a family tree, the faded edge of a painting. They lived in the margins, their existence acknowledged only as a problem to be solved, a threat to be managed, or a body to be married off or sent away. In some ways, this was the deepest cruelty of all, to grow up surrounded by images of your own family, knowing you would never truly belong to it. Yet, the shadows in those portraits have power too. The history of the forgotten ones is not entirely lost. Modern historians comb through these omissions, piecing together lies from fragments, a mention in a will, a faded letter, a scribbled name on the back of a painting. Each discovery is a reminder. The world was never as simple as the portrait suggested. The family was never as unified. The legacy never as secure. Every faceless figure in a tapestry was alive with hopes and fears and silent dreams. So, the next time you see a medieval tapestry, a family tree, or an ancient painting, look beyond the names that history wants you to remember. Search the edges, the shadows, the spaces where a figure almost appears. Ask yourself whose story is missing, whose life was edited away to make room for a single golden heir. The truth of the past is hidden not only in what is shown, but in what is left unsaid. The forgotten second sons are still there, woven into every silence, haunting every painted hall, waiting for someone to notice that their face, their story, and their place in the world was never truly erased, only hidden, just beyond the reach of memory. Imagine being woken before dawn by the clang of bells echoing down a stone corridor, your fate decided not by your own ambitions, but by the arithmetic of birth order and the ambitions of men far above you. In the 12th and 13th centuries, to be born a second son in a noble European household was to be marked for sacrifice long before you ever saw the battlefield. And nowhere did this brutal arithmetic reveal itself more mercilessly than in the Crusades, where thousands of barely trained, barely equipped young men were shipped eastward as political offerings, not warriors. This is not the story sung by poets or inscribed on cathedral walls. The songs of crusading glory, of chivalric knights and righteous battles, seldom mention the terrified, untested boys cast out as living currency for power. They do not recount the cold calculations made in candlelit chambers, where fathers and uncles decided that a surplus son could become a useful token in the grand chess game between kings and popes. But history, when stripped of its myth and legend, reveals a darker truth. The Crusades, for many noble families, were less a calling of faith and more a convenient answer to the question, what do you do with a child who will never inherit? It began with the Pope's call, Urban II in 1095, launching the First Crusade, and every papal echo for generations afterward. The cry to liberate Jerusalem, to defend Christendom, swept through Europe like wildfire, but the fervor masked an unspoken reality. Many lords, having no wish to divide their land among several sons and dilute their legacy, found the Crusades an irresistible opportunity. They could rid themselves of younger sons without incurring blame or shame. To the world, it looked like piety and sacrifice. In truth, it was survival and calculation. For these second sons, life changed overnight. The decision was made for them, sometimes by the flick of a father's hand across a map, sometimes with a single sentence, "You will make yourself useful." Few were trained for war. Most had been raised in the shadow of the air, learning enough Latin to read psalms, enough manners to serve at table, enough riding to keep up in a hunt. Swordplay, strategy, the brutal endurance of the seasoned knight, these were not their arts. Yet, within weeks or even days, they were dressed in ill-fitting mail, handed a sword, and herded into caravans bound for the ports of Marseille, Venice, or Genoa. Their journey to the Holy Land was no heroic passage. On the docks, they stood shoulder to shoulder with mercenaries, criminals seeking redemption, fanatics, and the truly desperate. None eager to die, all expendable. Ships crowded with men and horses set sail, the autumn, the air thick with prayers, rumors, and the stink of fear. Many fell ill before they ever glimpsed the Levantine shore. Disease swept the decks, and the weak were tossed overboard with hurried blessings. Those who survived the voyage were thrown into an alien, unforgiving world. The sun was harsher, the water unfamiliar, the food sparse and strange. Orders barked in half a dozen tongues added to the confusion. Seasoned knights formed their own cliques, jealously guarding rations and information, while the green boys from Europe, second sons, boys from broken houses, orphans, and illegitimates, were sent forward as shock troops, disposable bodies to absorb the first blows. Contemporary letters and chronicles are chilling in their bluntness. In a dispatch from the Second Crusade, a lord writes, "We lost many youths at the gates, but the line held." Another, recounting the siege of Acre, notes that the sons of the lesser houses perished quickly, unaccustomed to arms or hardship. There are accounts of entire companies of untrained noble sons routed in a single charge, never having truly fought, their names never recorded. The politics behind these sacrifices were intricate and merciless. For a European lord, sending a son to the Crusades was a triple gain. It appeased the Pope, earning spiritual favor and protection from excommunication. It proved loyalty to the king or emperor, sometimes resulting in new privileges, and it removed a potential rival to the heir, ensuring the estate would remain whole. The Church encouraged this practice, promising absolution and even sainthood for noble offerings. Few cared if the offering could actually wield a sword. There are bitter ironies woven through these stories. Some second sons, barely more than children, were knighted on the docks as they departed, given the trappings of honor without any of its security. Their mail was often second-hand, their swords heavy and unbalanced. They marched not at the front out of valor, but because someone had to go first, and the seasoned knights knew better than to be expendable. The Crusades themselves were monstrous engines of attrition. The siege of Jerusalem, the disastrous marches across Anatolia, the hellish heat of the desert, the sudden savage ambushes by Saracen cavalry, these were not training grounds, but slaughterhouses. For the untrained, the result was almost inevitable. There are records of boys collapsing from heat stroke in their armor, of drowning while trying to cross rivers, of freezing to death in sudden winter storms outside the walls of distant fortresses. Few even had the chance to die in true combat. Disease, starvation, and chaos claimed them first, and yet, for every nameless casualty, there was a family back home who spun their own version of events. Letters sent to Rome or the royal court extolled the sacrifice, sometimes inventing tales of valor or holy visions. Tombs were inscribed with "died for Christ," when, in truth, the young man may have died terrified and alone, never understanding the politics that sent him to his fate. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Those who limped home were rarely welcomed as heroes. They had failed in their supposed holy quest, often returning maimed, traumatized, or destitute. The family, having solved the problem of inheritance, often regarded their return as a disruption. Some survivors joined monastic orders, haunted by what they'd seen. Others became mercenaries, forever drifting on the margins of a society that used and then discarded them. But for the majority, those who never returned, history's silence is deafening. The chronicles of the Crusades list only the great lords and kings, the saints and the villains. The second sons, who perished in the dust and blood of the Holy Land, are remembered, if at all, as statistics. Great losses among the untried, many noble youths fallen, a host of young men offered unto God. What is left is a kind of ghost story threaded through the history of the Crusades. For every celebrated knight who stormed Jerusalem, a dozen forgotten boys died without swinging a sword, their names erased by the very politics that sent them away. Their bones rest in unmarked graves, beneath the ruined walls of castles and the sand of foreign fields. Their families went on, their elder brothers inherited, and the machinery of power ground forward, fed by their sacrifice. This is the hidden tragedy behind the pageantry. The real fate of the second sons who were sent to the Crusades, not as warriors, but as offerings. Used as appeasement to popes and kings, they died for causes they never chose and never truly understood. And while the history books may not speak their names, the silence they left behind is itself a testimony, a reminder of the cause, not of glory, but of being born second in a world that valued only the first. So, when you hear the tales of holy wars and chivalry, remember those who were not heroes or villains, but simply expendable, the four sons of Europe, lost before ever truly living, sacrificed to power, politics, and the pitiless arithmetic of history. Their stories, erased from the chronicles, remain etched in the empty places where their futures should have been. Imagine a castle on a low wind-swept hill, a fortress of stone, its banners flapping above cold walls. In the valleys below, a bitter famine spreads. The rivers run thin, and the fields have withered to dust. Food, once so abundant, it filled storerooms and cellars, has vanished. But behind the gates of the keep, the eldest son feasts, while his younger brother wastes away. This is not a legend, but a true echo from the fractured history of medieval Germany, a story buried in the chronicles of one noble estate, repeated in variations across the continent for centuries. Inheritance was a sword that divided families as surely as any army, and the famine that swept through the land did not soften those lines. It sharpened them. The elder son was the heir, by birthright, by law, by the blessing of his father's dying words. He controlled the land, the serfs, the stores of wheat and rye, locked deep in the castle's stone belly. He decided who ate and who waited. The younger son, once a companion and rival in childhood games, had become little more than an inconvenient mouth to feed. With no title, no income, no claim, he was left to fend for himself in the harsh world just outside the walls he once called home. In the year the famine struck, there was not enough for all. The estate's peasants were already suffering, boiling roots, gnawing on bark, praying for the rain that would not come. Within the keep, food was rationed, but always reserved for the ruling household. Guests, soldiers, loyal servants received their portion. The younger brother, no longer a child, but not a man with power, found his share shrinking, then disappearing entirely. He begged his elder for aid. The chroniclers say he went to the great hall, knelt at the stone threshold, and pleaded for a sack of grain, a side of salted pork, anything to sustain him until the harvest. But the laws of primogeniture were as cold as the stone under his knees. The eldest said, "The stores are for those who serve the house. You are not of the house. You are a burden, not a brother." The younger brother was sent away, not with violence, but with indifference, the sharpest cruelty, the kind that is justified by law and tradition. He wandered the estate's edge, surviving on what little he could glean from sympathetic villagers or what remained in forgotten garden plots. Each day, he could see the castle on the hill, its lighted windows, its guards standing on the parapets, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread drifting across the fields, a reminder of warmth just out of reach. People noticed his decline, a shadow moving from door to door, hollow cheeks, trembling hands. Sometimes he slept in the ruins of an old chapel, using a torn cloak for warmth, listening to the wind howl through the broken glass. The estate's priest, bound by duty to the ruling lord, offered prayers but little else. Food, after all, was a resource to be managed, not shared freely. Rumors spread among the villagers, whispers of the lost brother, once a lord's son, now hungrier than any peasant. Some say that in the final weeks he wandered to the very edge of the castle moat, hoping his elder would see him and relent. But the doors remained closed, the portcullis lowered, the storeroom sealed, no mercy. Only the unbending logic of hierarchy. The firstborn rules, the rest survive or not. The day the younger brother died, the famine had reached its cruelest grip. He was found by a shepherd, only miles from the family keep, thin as a reed, shrouded in the rags of a name that no longer held power. The official story in the castle was simple. He was weak, the times were hard. It could not be helped. But in the villages and among the servants, the tale grew heavier. The story became a warning that blood is not always thicker than bread, and that family, under the weight of hunger and law, can become stranger than any enemy. The castle endured. The eldest son ruled for years. His was estate passing to his own children. But something lingered in the stones, a sense of emptiness, a cold draught in the halls. It said the villagers remembered the famine far longer than the lord who survived it. They remembered the boy who died within sight of his father's house, denied by his own brother. The next time the harvest failed, more eyes turned toward the keep. Less faith was given to those who ruled behind its walls. For some, the loyalty that once bound them to the noble house was broken forever. History records the laws, primogeniture, right of inheritance, the protection of estate and bloodline. But beneath those cold lines are stories like this, of brothers divided not by war but by hunger, of castles built to protect families but just as easily used to entomb them, of loyalty and betrayal measured not in battle but in the quiet refusal of a loaf of bread. What does it mean to starve while your brother dines in plenty, both of you born of the same name? It means that in the shadow of power, even family is fragile, splintered by custom, by pride, by the ancient belief that one life is worth more than another if it sits closer to the throne. The stones of that German castle still stand, though the banners have faded, the storerooms emptied and filled 100 times over. But if you walk the fields below, you might feel it still, the memory of a boy who died hungry, and a brother who ruled, and the silent distance that can stretch between two hearts, even when separated only by a few short miles, and a door that would not open. Betrayed for a title, in the shadowed heart of every old castle, beneath the banners and behind the walls, there runs an undercurrent of rivalry that no tapestry can conceal. In the world of noble blood and inherited power, loyalty is never simple, and brotherhood is rarely safe. Nowhere is this truth more bitter than in the story of the second son, the one born not to rule, but to serve. Yet, sometimes, even obedience is a danger. Sometimes, a second son's greatest crime is to be too loyal, too brave, or, fatally, too beloved. Imagine a borderland in late medieval Europe where family feuds and shifting alliances are written in blood and land is the only true currency. The firstborn son, heir to the estate, is raised to believe that his destiny is not merely to possess, but to command. His younger brother, the second son, is trained in loyalty, taught to fight at his brother's side, to bleed for the family name, to ask nothing for himself. The second son grows up believing that victory for the house is victory for all. He becomes the blade in his brother's hand, the trusted confidant, the face in the background of every family triumph. Then comes the day when the kingdom's border is threatened. The firstborn leads a charge, but it's the second son who turns the tide. A bold flanking maneuver, a rallying speech to wavering troops, perhaps even saving his brother's life in the chaos of battle. The victory is resounding. Songs are sung, tales are told, and in every version the second son's courage glimmers. Peasants cheer him in the village. Soldiers whisper that he would make a fine lord, perhaps finer than the heir himself. At first, the elder brother celebrates. He raises a goblet to his sibling in the feasting hall, offers a seat near the head of the table. But as the days pass, shadows creep into his thoughts. He begins to notice the way people turn to his brother in crisis, the affection in their eyes. Gratitude twists into fear. The heir has everything to lose: title, power, even his very place in history, and so what was once brotherhood becomes suspicion. In a world where power is inherited, not earned, there is no greater threat than a loyal second who inspires love. History is filled with tales like this, sometimes written in dry legal documents, sometimes only whispered in letters and memoirs. In one French family, a second son named Luc fought at his brother's side in a border skirmish with Spain. He was fearless, charismatic, beloved by the men. When the victory was secured, Luc found himself the subject of praise, not just from the soldiers, but from rival nobles, men who wondered if the wrong brother wore the crown. Within weeks, Luc was accused of plotting treason. The evidence was vague, a conversation overheard, a letter twisted in its meaning, a rivalry that only existed in the mind of the frightened heir. In the eyes of the law, accusation was enough. Luc was stripped of his armor, declared a traitor, and sent into exile, his name erased from the rolls, his heroism repaid with banishment. Why did this happen again and again, across centuries and continents? Because in the cruel logic of inheritance, a brother's triumph is always a potential threat. Nobility was obsessed with legitimacy. Order depended on the world believing that birthright alone decided who ruled and who obeyed. When a second son outshone the heir, it was not just a personal embarrassment, it was an existential risk. What if the family, the vassals, the king himself began to doubt the firstborn's right to rule? What if someone whispered, "Shouldn't the better man wear the title?" In that moment, love turns to paranoia and gratitude to self-preservation. There is a deep, chilling irony here. The more useful and loyal a second son became, the more he endangered himself. If he was dull, he was ignored. If he was cunning, he was feared. If he was brave, he was exiled. The system demanded that he help, but never shine too brightly. To love the family was to risk everything for it, and then to be cast aside when that love made him powerful. The trauma of such betrayal echoed through generations. Some exiled sons became mercenaries, wandering from war to war, seeking purpose in the violence they had mastered for their brother's sake. Others tried to return, only to be hunted as traitors. A few, burning with resentment, plotted actual rebellion. Their loyalty soured into vengeance. The history of Europe is littered with uprisings and civil wars, seeded by brotherly fear, by the old unspoken truth that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a rival who shares your blood. Think of the psychological damage inflicted in such a system. The firstborn son, raised to expect loyalty, but trained to fear affection. The second son, raised to serve but doomed by his own excellence. Both brothers haunted by suspicion, never knowing if today's feast would become tomorrow's accusation. The second son's life was a lesson in limits. Be strong, but not too strong. Be loyal, but not too beloved. Serve, but never let them see you as a leader. In exile, these men carried their wounds for life. Some wrote desperate letters home, begging for forgiveness for a crime they never committed. Others erased their old names, building new lives in distant cities, always looking over their shoulders. Some became legends, outlaws, adventurers, romanticized in ballads as noble victims of a cruel fate. But for most, the story ended quietly, far from home, remembered only in the bitter warnings whispered to new generations of second sons. Even now, echoes of this pattern survive. Families still teach children to beware of jealousy, to dim their own light for the sake of peace. Organizations, companies, even entire nations fear the upstart who wins too much affection. But the origins of this fear are ancient, born in the cold stone halls of feudal Europe, where to love your brother was to risk losing everything, and where betrayal for a title was a wound that bled through centuries, never fully healed in the end. The lesson is as brutal as it is timeless. In a world ruled by inheritance, even the greatest loyalty can become your greatest threat. And sometimes, the person who calls you brother is only waiting for the day you become too loved to be allowed to stay. The wandering mercenary with noble blood. In the shadowed corridors of medieval castles, as inheritance was sorted and futures divided like loot after a siege, a silent verdict was passed on every noble second son. You will not rule, you will not own, and the world you were born to is already promised to another. For centuries, the firstborn inherited everything: castle, title, power, memory. The second sons, left to orbit this golden sun, were given no such certainty. Their birthright was not land, but longing, not wealth, but wandering. And so, across Europe, thousands set out, some with hope, many with bitterness, on a path that would forge them into mercenaries, exiles, and forgotten men with noble blood. Picture a boy growing up in a stone hall, taught the same lessons as his elder brother: how to ride, to wield a sword, to speak the languages of kings and priests. But as he grows, the doors begin to close. His name is not stitched into family banners. His future is not discussed in council. At feasts, his achievements are praised with the gentle sadness reserved for things that cannot last. All the world is his, except for the only piece that matters: home. By the time he is old enough to fight, he knows that every inch of this place belongs to someone else. Some second sons found themselves bound for monasteries or obscure marriages, but for many, the only road left was the soldiers. In a continent perpetually at war, there was always need for men with the right breeding and the wrong prospects. Cast adrift from their families, these men became the lifeblood of mercenary companies, roving bands who fought for coin instead of country, trading their names and skills to the highest bidder. The world they entered was both brutal and strangely free. In the lands of Italy, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the banners of mercenary bands filled the horizon. Condottieri in the north, free companies in the south, Swiss pikemen in the east. Here, a man could rise by skill or by luck, could carve his legacy with steel and blood, yet it was a life without roots. The mercenary carried his past as a private wound, his family's name often concealed, his title never spoken except in drunken boasts around the campfire. Some of these men achieved great renown. The chronicles are dotted with names of English knights who became captains in foreign wars, French nobles who rode with Spanish kings, Dermond's second sons who led ragtag armies through the mud and fire of 100 battles. But for every story of glory, there are 10 of loss, of ambition spent, and honor squandered in places far from home. They fought not just for pay, but for a sense of self that the laws of inheritance had stolen from them. Their courage was real, but their victories were borrowed, never enough to arrest the shadow of their brother's castle. Consider the noblemen who fought in 7 countries, whose story flickers in the margins of medieval annals. He grew up learning the art of war, not as a birthright, but as a last resort. He served under banners foreign and strange, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always an outsider. He spoke the tongues of half of Europe, dined with lords one night, and starved beside peasants the next. Every battle was a wager to buy back a piece of lost dignity, every scar a mark of a home that did not want him back. Yet the world of mercenaries was cold. There were no songs for the men who survived. In the chaos of retreat, when the gold ran out and the banners fell, second sons died nameless, stripped of honor, buried in ditches or shallow graves. No priest intoned their lineage, no monument bore their crest. Their bones mingled with the common dead, forgotten by the families that had once paraded them in velvet and gold. If they were remembered at all, it was as cautionary tales. Look and obey, lest you too die far from home, unwept, unclaimed. This exile was more than physical. It was a kind of living ghosthood, a perpetual outsider status that no victory could erase. The true tragedy was not in death, but in erasure. A nobleman dying in a muddy field, his name written nowhere, his story untold except as a rumor in the next camp, his bloodline ending with a silent gasp. In old age, those few who survived often found themselves wandering still, old swords at their side, eyes haunted by battles no one would ever commemorate. They were men without an ending, their lives tapering into oblivion, while their families recited genealogies that skipped their names entirely. Yet, even as they vanished from the official story, the world they helped create remained. The ceaseless wars of medieval Europe, soaked in the ambitions and betrayals of the powerful, were won and lost on the backs of these forgotten sons. The mercenary companies they led became the prototypes for future armies, that the techniques they learned, the alliances they forged, the chaos they left behind, all shaped the continent's future in ways the nobility could never fully control. Some of these men did leave behind something tangible. A handful wrote memoirs, crude or elegant, chronicling their pain and pride in battered journals. Others were immortalized in the bitter jokes and warnings of their homeland. Beware the hungry brother, for he'll sell your crown to any king. Sometimes, when a lucky one returned, old, scarred, and finally noticed, he might be given a token title, a small estate, a quiet place to fade away. But for most, there was only the long road, the clang of steel, and the hope that somewhere, someone might remember the truth, that once they were princes in all but name. Even today, when we trace the lines of European history, we rarely pause to wonder about the second sons, those exiles with noble blood, those wandering mercenaries buried in unmarked graves, those faces lost to the tapestry of power. Yet, in every forgotten battlefield, In every country where foreign bones lie under native soil, their story endures, not as heroes or villains, but as a silent testament to the price of inheritance, the cruelty of order, and the wild, lonely courage of those who refused to simply disappear. So when you see the family portraits with their missing faces, or the genealogies with their empty branches, remember the armies that march under no flag but hope. Remember the second sons whose lives became legend only in the telling, and whose greatest victory was that, for a few brief moments, they existed at all. Used in place of a ransom hostage, the great stone halls of medieval Europe echo with tales of conquest and dynastic ambition, but rarely do we hear the quiet footsteps of those who bore the cost of power, the expendable, the unnamed, the second sons. In a world where inheritance was everything and the firstborn son was sacred, the younger brother often found himself forced into a role as thankless as it was perilous. The substitute hostage, ransomed in another man's name. It's a scene that unfolded across centuries and kingdoms. A noble lord, caught on the losing side of a feud, a skirmish, or a failed rebellion, is captured and held for ransom. The price is set, a fortune in silver, control of a contested manor, perhaps a public act of humility. But such negotiations did not always end with the captive's release. Instead, the victors demanded an additional guarantee, hostages, pledges of good faith, to be kept until the ransom was paid in full or the treaty honored. And here, the real logic of medieval family strategy revealed itself. The eldest son, the heir, was too valuable, too essential for the survival of the family line to risk in enemy hands. His safety was paramount, for without him, estates would splinter, alliances collapse, and dynasties fall. Instead, it was the second son, the spare, who was sent, sometimes the third, sometimes even a favored nephew, but most often it was the one whose life mattered only so long as it protected the firstborn's future. To be a second son in these moments was to become a living token in a game of high-stakes negotiation, a sacrifice disguised as loyalty. Hostage exchanges were solemn affairs. Picture the torch-lit night, the procession of armored men escorting a boy or young man to the enemy camp. The terms would be read aloud, witnessed by clerics and scribes. The family promises payment. The youth is held in good keeping until the debt is settled. Sometimes the hostage was embraced by his father, told he was performing an honorable service for the house. More often, the moment was wordless, heavy with the knowledge that return was uncertain, and the price of failure could be exile, imprisonment, or death. Medieval chronicles are filled with the names of hostages, but rarely with their fates. Some were treated well, given the rooms in rival castles, their presence used as leverage to enforce peace. But the reality could be much darker. When ransoms were delayed or politics shifted, hostages became bargaining chips, caught in webs of power and suspicion. Many were moved from one fortress to another, held in damp chambers, left with little more than their prayers and whatever letters their family managed to send. The odds of return were never assured. In France, England, Spain, across the Holy Roman Empire, second sons vanished into the silence of captivity. Some families found themselves unable or unwilling to pay the ransom in full. Debts could stretch for years. Treaties collapsed. The tides of war changed, and the fate of hostages was forgotten in the rush of new campaigns. There are records of boys sent to castles in Brittany or Burgundy who simply never came back. Their families, unable to raise the silver, their names quietly omitted from family trees. In some cases, Hostages became casualties of political revenge, executed when a truce broke or a payment failed. The chronicles record the events in cold language: hostages forfeit, pledges executed, as if their lives were numbers in a ledger. But even when a hostage was returned, the scars of captivity could last a lifetime. Some were ransomed after years in isolation, changed men, physically weakened, emotionally scarred, haunted by the knowledge that their survival depended entirely on the political fortunes of others. In a few rare cases, hostages managed to carve out new roles for themselves in their captors' courts, adapting to foreign lands and even marrying into rival families. But for most, the experience was one of powerlessness, fear, and abandonment. The emotional cost on the families left behind was profound, though rarely acknowledged. To send a child, often barely a man, sometimes still a boy, into the hands of an enemy required a degree of calculation that defied ordinary parental love. Yet, for the great houses of Europe, the stakes were too high to permit sentiment. The heir must survive, no matter the cost to the others. It was a decision made in cold rooms, with cold eyes, the arithmetic of inheritance outweighing the bonds of blood. There were moments of resistance, of course. Some second sons, sensing the risk, tried to flee, only to be hunted down and delivered under armed guard. Others accepted their fate with a grim sense of duty, finding pride in the idea that their suffering protected the family name. Medieval letters sometimes reveal mothers pleading for the safe return of a son, or younger siblings left behind, lighting candles in empty chapels, hoping for a miracle. But history, as always, favored the strong. The eldest sons inherited, the houses endured, the stories of the hostages faded into the margins, remembered only in the haunted eyes of those who survived, and in the silence of those who did not. This practice was not confined to one kingdom or century. In England's long wars with France, noble families routinely sent their younger sons as pledges for the release of high-ranking captives, sometimes exchanging the same boy more than once, depending on the shifting tides of battle and alliance. In Spain, during the Reconquista, hostages were standard bargaining tools between Christian and Moorish rulers. The Castilian court sent extra sons to Moorish strongholds as a sign of good faith, but the records show that many never returned, their fates lost in the dust of shifting borders and broken truces. Even the most powerful families were not immune. When Richard the Lionheart was captured on his return from Crusade, an enormous ransom was demanded, and dozens of noble hostages were offered as surety, including sons, nephews, and the younger brothers of England's greatest houses. Some came home, others simply disappeared from the rolls. Their loss was rarely mourned in public, but in private, the absence could never be entirely explained away. It is a history written in gaps, in silences, in the blank spaces between names on a genealogy. The practice of sending second sons as ransom hostages reveals a world where the value of a life was always measured against the needs of the family, the survival of the bloodline, the unending cycle of war and negotiation. For every celebrated heir who rose to greatness, there are a dozen brothers who vanish quietly, sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. And so, behind every tale of medieval glory, of castles held and kingdoms won, lingers the memory of those who paid the hidden price, the second sons who walked willingly or not into the darkness of captivity, trading their freedom and sometimes their very lives for the survival of a name they would never inherit. Their voices, lost to history, remind us that even in the grandest halls, power is always built on the backs of the expendable, and the silence of the hostages echoes longer than any song of victory. Abandoned at a monastery gate, imagine the cold dawn light on stone walls, the quiet mist curling through a monastery garden. Somewhere, a bell tolls the first hour of prayers. On this morning, a small child stands at the heavy wooden gate, shivering, blinking, barely old enough to understand his own name. He has been brought here in secret, far from his family's estate, far from the laughter and warmth of a household he will barely remember. His parents, having made their decision in a silent agreement, leave him without a word and do not look back. This is not myth, but a documented truth. In the medieval world, to be a second son was to live at the mercy of tradition and fortune. For noble families, inheritance was a puzzle with only one real solution: the firstborn son, heir to the title, the land, the fortune. All others were surplus, useful only if they could be moved from the board without complication. And so, when times grew uncertain or estates could not be divided, the solution was simple. The second son, sometimes barely more than a toddler, was sent away. The records speak in sparse, formal language, placed at the abbey for his education and spiritual welfare. But behind those words is the heartbreak of a child exiled from his own story. Some were taken on the pretense of a pilgrimage or a visit, their bags packed with a few changes of clothing, perhaps a toy, a keepsake from home. The journey might take days, across winding roads, through towns and forests, the landscape growing ever more unfamiliar. The child clings to a servant's hand, asks when he will see his mother, his father, his siblings again, but there are no answers. The servants were sworn to silence, or simply did not care to explain. At the monastery gate, the boy's name is spoken for the last time as the son of his house. There are no goodbyes, no letters, no gifts pressed into his hand. The parents turn away, their faces set and unreadable, driven by custom, fear, or ambition. Sometimes it was seen as an act of mercy, better to be raised in the care of monks than left adrift in a brutal world. But to the child, it is an erasure. The life he knew is gone in a single, unremembered moment. Inside the walls, the monastery is both refuge and prison. The monks are kind, or they are not. The days are long and filled with ritual, prayers, lessons, labor in the gardens, silent meals. The child is given a new name, new clothes, a new destiny. Sometimes he flourishes. The lucky ones become scholars, scribes, even abbots. They find a sense of purpose in the order and silence, but many do not. Many live with a hollow ache, the sense of a door closed behind them. A family that chose never to write, never to visit, never to acknowledge what was lost. The emotional cost is immeasurable. The child grows into a man always wondering, did they love me? Did they regret their choice? Or was I only ever a problem to be solved? In the dark, cold cells of the abbey, in the echoing stone halls, the questions grow heavier with each passing year. Some boys, abandoned so young, forget their origins, inventing stories to fill the silence. Others remember every detail: the sound of their mother's voice, the distant smoke of their father's study, the face of a brother or sister waving as the carriage pulled away. There were practical reasons for this practice. Inheritance law left little room for sentiment. Dividing an estate among many sons would dilute power, weaken families, threaten generations of carefully guarded status. The church, hungry for influence, welcomed these children, turning their tragedy into a source of labor, devotion, sometimes even wealth. Some noble parents truly believed they were giving their sons a higher calling, a chance to escape the violence and uncertainty of secular life. But for many, it was a matter of convenience, or fear, or simply the inability to imagine a future outside the strictures of tradition. The story of the abandoned child at the monastery gate is a theme thread woven through the fabric of medieval Europe. There are letters that survive, written in careful script by monks who recorded the arrival of such boys, received a child of noble birth, left by his family to be raised in the service of God. No mention of the tears shed on the other side of the wall, no record of the silence that follows, of the years in which the parents never write, never send word, never let the child know if he is missed. For the monastery, life goes on. New children arrive, others take their vows, some rebel and are punished or sent away. The world outside forgets the boy, even as the seasons pass, and he grows into a stranger to his own family's name. Sometimes, years later, he will be summoned to witness a will, to bless a marriage, to say the last prayers over a dying parent who once left him at the threshold and never turned back. If you walk through the ruins of an old abbey, you might imagine the ghosts of those lost children, echoes of footsteps along the cloister, voices that never quite learned to call any place home. You might feel the ache of lives uprooted for reasons of power, of custom, of the cold logic of survival. To be abandoned at a monastery gate is to be erased with kindness, to be forgotten with ceremony. It is a history written not only in records, but in the silence left behind, a silence that echoes even now through the walls of memory and stone. Loyalty meant death. In the cold calculus of medieval Europe, the price of loyalty was measured in blood, and for many noble families, it was the second son who paid that price. When the banners were raised and the family crest marched into war, it was rarely the eldest who rode at the front lines. No, the heir was too valuable, too burdened by the future. Instead, it was the younger sons, eager, desperate for approval, hungry to carve out a name, that were sent forward as living shields. Their fate was as predictable as it was cruel, to die defending the family's honor, while their older brothers took the credit and later drank to their memory. Across centuries of feudal conflict, this grim dynamic repeated itself again and again. In the chronicles of countless houses, the second son is a recurring, tragic figure, a boy raised with all the trappings of nobility, but with none of the inheritance. For him, loyalty was the only path to meaning. From the moment he could walk, he was taught that his purpose was to serve the family line, if not by the sword, then by sacrifice. There was no greater proof of love, no more honorable end than to lay down one's life so that the name and estate might endure. History's record books overflow with these stories, though rarely do they name the fallen. In the Norman conquest of England, dozens of younger sons rode out, their shields freshly painted, their hearts full of stories of Arthur and Roland. They died by the hundreds in mud-soaked fields, their banners trampled and names left to be mourned only in private, if at all. The eldest, meanwhile, returned to the castle, greeted as conqueror, inheritor, and the living embodiment of the family's triumph. Consider the famous feud between the Montforts and the Clares in 13th century England. When their armies clashed at Evesham and Lewes, it was the younger sons who bore the brunt, sent to storm the breach, to ride against impossible odds, to lead desperate sallies and hold the line when hope was lost. Some chronicles mention them only as the gallant youth who fell, or as the Lord's brave brother. In rare letters that survive, grieving mothers or quietly furious servants whisper the truth. The sacrifice was expected, almost demanded, and the reward for such courage was silence, or, at best, a brief eulogy spoken over a hurried grave. The psychology of this loyalty is as dark as it is fascinating. The second son denied the estate, the title, and the promise of future power, grew up searching for some way to matter. The only currency left to him was bravery, a willingness to bleed in the name of the family crest, to risk everything for the slim chance of honor or recognition. In many houses, young boys were raised on stories of martyrs and heroes, told again and again that a noble death was the highest achievement. What was left unsaid was that such a death also cleared the way for the firstborn's uncontested rule. Behind the closed doors of the great halls, politics dictated these fates. The family could not afford to lose its heir in a pointless skirmish, but it also could not appear cowardly or weak. The solution was painfully simple. Send the younger brothers and let their bodies shield the future of the line. If they survived, they might be rewarded with a small estate, a minor office, or a mention in the family prayers. If they died, they were remembered briefly and then forgotten, their sacrifice absorbed into the legend of the family name. For some, the injustice was too much to bear. The few second sons who survived enough campaigns sometimes returned bitter, heartened, changed. Some rebelled, joining mercenary bands or striking out to found their own fortunes in foreign lands. Others accepted their fate with grim dignity, training their own sons for the same role, loyal to the bitter end, knowing that their deaths would serve a future they'd never see. Occasionally, in the surviving letters and diaries, there are flashes of resentment, envy, and quiet rage. He drank the wine, but I paid the price, writes one anonymous younger son in a letter never meant to be read by family eyes. There were also moments of tragic irony. The firstborn, celebrated and showered with praise, often owed his victories and titles to the sacrifices of his brothers. Chronicles tell of banquets where the heir is toasted as a hero, while servants quietly remember the bloodied body of his brother, returned on a cart, buried without ceremony on the edge of the estate. In one infamous case, a second son who defended his family's retreat at Cressy was left unburied in the field, his brother too busy celebrating the family's triumph to recover the body. Only years later did a passing monk find his name carved in a battered shield, half buried in the mud. Yet this is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a story about the perilous cost of duty, the toxic expectations of family, and the psychological traps set by tradition. The second son, born with the same blood but none of the privilege, internalized a loyalty so absolute it became a death sentence. Even as he rode into battle, he knew in his bones that he would not be the one to inherit, to rule, or even to be remembered. Loyalty was demanded, not asked for. Death was the only proof of devotion that could never be questioned. Across Europe, from the fields of France to the forests of Poland, countless gravestones and faded memorials bear only initials or family crests, marking the place where a loyal son fell. The heirs built fortunes on their brothers' bones, married into new power, and kept the cycle turning for another generation. The world remembers the winners, the inheritors, the lords of the manor, but beneath every shining crest, every grand estate, is the hidden history of second sons. Boys raised to be loyal, men taught that death for the family was the highest good, and whose last act of love was to vanish so that another might live and claim the glory. This is the true price of loyalty, written not in songs or titles, but in the silent ledger of sacrifice. And though the world may forget their names, the story of the second sons lives on in every shadow at the edge of a battlefield, in every family toast that omits the ones who made it possible, in every heart that wonders what true loyalty really demands. Given the family sword, but not the legacy, there are some gifts so heavy, so loaded with meaning, that to accept them is to carry a silent curse. Picture a cold stone hall at dawn, banners hanging limp, and the faces of a noble family gathered in shadow. At the head of the table sits the patriarch, old and unbending, the living embodiment of tradition. His will is law. At his side, the eldest son, already dressed in his father's colors, already rehearsing the mannerisms of a future lord. Down the table, the second son waits. He's younger, maybe more daring, perhaps even more beloved by the knights and servants who see him in the training yard or hear him sing at feasts. But it does not matter. The law is a law. Land, castle, and name belong to the firstborn. And then the father rises, sword in hand, a blade with a name, stained by centuries of family blood. It has defended the castle from siege, led charges across muddy fields, appeared in the hands of ancestors whose faces still look down from the tapestries. This sword is more than a weapon. It is the beating heart of the family's legend. The younger son is called forward. The room falls silent. Perhaps, for a moment, hope flickers. Will this be the day a tradition breaks? Will the old man choose merit over birthright? But no. The speech is ritual. The gesture is practiced. The father extends a sword, not to the heir, but to the younger. There are tears, maybe, or pride, maybe even love, in a way that men of steel and rule never learned to speak. But behind the prize tithe, there is a wall of finality. Take this, the father says, and bring honor to our name. Fight for the house. Defend your brother. Serve your king. The blade is cold. Its weight is enormous. But the keys to the castle stay in the elder's pocket. The land, the vault, the legacy, all remain out of reach. For the younger son, this moment is both coronation and exile. To be given the sword, but not the birthright, is to be declared a warrior without a home, a knight who will always ride out, but never ride back as master. The symbol cuts both ways. You are good enough to defend us, to bleed for us, to die for us, but never to rule us. This was not just one family's cruelty. It was a system stretching across medieval Europe and beyond. The logic was everywhere. Keep the land whole, the bloodline pure, the power undiluted. Firstborns inherit, the rest must serve. When tradition ran up against affection, tradition won. Imagine the psychological toll of such a gift. For some younger sons, the sword was a consolation prize, proof they had value, even if it was the value of muscle and sacrifice. For others, it was a taunt. You may wear the armor, you may win glory, but you will always kneel to your brother. The chroniclers of the Middle Ages rarely wrote about these men. Their victories were credited to the house, their failures were their own. Their deaths, often far from home, were written off as service. If they survived, their children might inherit the sword, but never the name. Their legacy was to enable the legacy of others. History overflows with the stories left behind in the margins. In 14th century Burgundy, a younger son named Armand was given his father's renowned sword, a weapon that had broken lances and ended feuds for generations. But the land, the castle, the very name that made the sword worth having, these went to his older brother. Armand rode at the vanguard of every campaign, leading men who whispered that he was the better lord, the true spirit of the house. He returned from war with scars, a legend among knights, but when he dismounted at the gates, he was only a guest. His bed was in the guest quarters. His stories were told in their kitchens, not the hall. In the end, his sword was hung above the fireplace as a curiosity, while the family name continued down a line of mediocrity. But not every story is so tragic. Some younger sons carved out destinies of their own. With sword in hand, they ventured across borders, becoming mercenaries, crusaders, founders of new lineages. The sword was their ticket to a dangerous kind of freedom, but it came with loneliness, exile, and the constant reminder that home was not theirs to claim. Others accepted their fate, becoming the trusted right arm of their brothers, always defending, never commanding, building someone else's legend. A few, unable to bear the humiliation, turned their blades against the family itself. History remembers these moments as treachery, but at their root was the cruelty of a gift that was never meant to be fully owned. The symbolism is as sharp as the steel itself. In every war, in every household, the sword was a promise. You are part of us, but not equal. You can carry the burden of our survival, but never share the reward. For some, this sparked ambition, the drive to prove worth by deeds rather than inheritance. For most, it became a lifetime of living between worlds, noble by blood, common by fate. Some tried to raise their sons to break the cycle, only to find the world unchanged. The laws of primogeniture, the inertia of tradition, were stronger than the will of any one man. Even in the modern age, the echoes of this ritual persist. We still give out swords, metaphorical or literal, to those we ask to fight for causes not truly theirs. We still praise loyalty, bravery, and sacrifice, but reserve the legacy for those born lucky. In old photographs and fading documents, you can see the younger sons, posed in armor, eyes steeled against hope. Their stories are there, if you know how to look for them, hidden behind the records of their brothers, haunting the places they defended, but never called their own. So the next time you see a family crest, a blade displayed on a castle wall, or a story of heroism cut short, remember the hands that carried the sword but never signed the deeds. Remember the courage it takes to accept a gift that is also a denial. Remember the sons who rode out not for glory, but for the right to belong, who gave everything and received only a symbol, sharp as truth, heavy as silence. In their silence, the true cost of a legacy is written, not in gold or land, but in the hopes denied and the heroes left unnamed. Servants to their own brothers, in the stone halls of medieval castles, where banners fluttered and legacy was etched in stone. Not all those born of noble blood lived as masters. Among the many tragedies hidden behind the grandeur of lineage and power was the fate of the second son, born into privilege, yet forced to serve beneath the shadow of his own blood. While the firstborn held titles, lands, and the loyalty of vassals, his younger brother, despite sharing the same walls and name, was reduced to a steward, a servant cloaked in finery, managing estates, but powerless within his own ancestral home. Imagine a sprawling castle, its walls echoing with the footsteps of lords and ladies, of knights and retainers, and amid them walks a man, both familiar and estranged. This man carries the blood of the family, but lacks the authority. His coat of arms is a faded echo, his voice often overshadowed by the louder claims of the air. He moves through corridors he helped oversee, yet every command he issues is filtered through the Lord's will. His duty is to maintain the lands, collect rents, oversee harvests, and manage the very people who see him as an outsider, not quite a master, but far above a common servant. This was the bitter paradox for many second sons. In a world where primogeniture ruled with iron certainty, the eldest brother inherited everything, leaving the rest with crumbs of power, if any at all. The law was clear. The family estate must remain undivided to preserve strength and influence. Dividing lands among sons risked fragmentation and feuding. But what of the younger sons, who stayed close to home? They became the invisible pillars of the estate's machinery, tasked with responsibility but stripped of authority. Their titles were ambiguous, their roles nebulous. Some were called stewards or seneschals, titles that suggested importance but masked real subservience. They acted as the Lord's right hand, but only as long as the Lord permitted. Their decisions could be overturned by a mere word from their elder brother. To the tenants and serfs, these second sons were often just another part of the Lord's household staff, their noble birth a forgotten detail. The psychological toll was immense. To live under your brother's command was to exist in a liminal state, neither fully noble lord nor common servant. Family dinners were quiet battles for recognition. Estates once imagined as your inheritance became workplaces where you labored without reward or respect. Letters between nobles sometimes hint at the bitterness behind closed doors, resentment simmering beneath the forced smiles, jealousies sharpened by constant comparison. The younger brother who tended the harvest fields was haunted by the memory of the ancestral hall he was barred from leading. This dynamic also bred complex relationships within the family. The elder brother's authority was absolute, but the younger's loyalty was expected to be unwavering. Any hint of dissent could be seen as betrayal. In some cases, second sons became instruments of their elder brother's power, enforcing laws and collecting taxes with cold efficiency. Their intimate knowledge of the estate made them effective, but their subservience made them vulnerable. A disgruntled steward brother could be dismissed, exiled, or worse, erased from the family narrative. Yet many accepted this fate, finding ways to wield influences from the shadows. Managing the daily operations of vast estates required intelligence, diplomacy, and leadership. Some second sons cultivated networks among the clergy, merchants, or neighboring lords, building a sphere of soft power. They became indispensable. Without them, the estates would crumble, but their power was always conditional, always behind the throne they could never claim. Historical records offer glimpses into these lives. Account books signed by lesser-known lords, letters pleading for recognition, legal disputes where younger brothers contested the limits of their stewardship. There were stories of second sons who used their position to amass personal wealth, marrying heiresses or investing in trade to carve out independence. Yet, these were exceptions rather than the rule. The medieval world was unforgiving to those who lacked titles, and power was rarely shared generously. The rigid social hierarchy ensured that second sons who stayed home lived in a paradoxical servitude, servants to their own blood, managing lands that were their birthright, yet never truly theirs. Their legacy was a quiet one, etched in ledgers and whispered rumors rather than grand monuments or heraldic displays. In many ways, their story reflects the harsh realities of inheritance and power in a world built on hierarchy and primogeniture. To be born noble was not always to be born free. The second son's life was a study in contradictions, rich in bloodline, poor in authority, close to power, yet forever outside it, steward of legacy, yet denied its glory. So, when you gaze upon the imposing castles and hear tales of noble families, remember those who dwelled within their walls, yet lived as servants to their own brothers. They kept the estates alive, bore the burdens of management, and navigated a world where family ties meant duty, obedience, and silent sacrifice. Their stories may be faint in history's echo, but their presence shaped the very fabric of medieval life, and their lives, lived in quiet servitude, were no less noble in courage or complexity. Exiled for falling in love. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval noble families, love was rarely a matter of the heart alone. It was a currency, a strategic move, a weapon in the unending game of power, inheritance, and alliance. For a second son, born not to inherit, but to serve as backup, pawn, or afterthought. Falling in love with a wrong woman could mean exile, disgrace, and a future erased by the walls of a monastery. This is the story of such a son. Not a famous king, not a celebrated knight, but a younger brother, caught in a perilous web of family ambition and forbidden desire. His name lost to history, his tale survives only in the faint echoes of court gossip and the cold records of church orders. Yet it reveals a harsh truth. In a world where every marriage was a treaty, and every love a potential threat to inheritance, thus the second son had little freedom, not even over his own heart. The noble woman in question was a prize in her own right. Born of a powerful family, she was coveted, not just for her beauty, but for her lineage, her dowry, and the alliances she could secure. Her hand was promised, or at least desired, by the elder son, the heir, the one destined to carry the family line forward. For the eldest, marriage was a calculated step, carefully arranged by fathers and mothers who understood that a single misstep could unravel decades of strategy. But love, unpredictable and unyielding, found the younger brother first. Whether it was a stolen glance across a sunlit hall, whispered conversations in shadowed gardens, or a shared moment of kindness amid court intrigue, the bond between them grew, quiet, forbidden, dangerous. In a society where the family's honor depended on strict obedience, this growing affection was a threat of the highest order. When the elder brother learned of this secret affection, the consequences were swift and brutal. Jealousy, betrayal, and fear intertwined. To tolerate such a challenge to his claim would be to invite chaos, questions over succession, divisions within the house, and the possible loss of alliances secured through marriage. The second son's love was no longer a private matter, but a public danger. In medieval Europe, the solution to such problems was often exile, cloaked in piety. The younger brother was summoned, not with threats, but with the promise of salvation and honor, to take holy vows. A monastery, often remote and austere, awaited him. There, cloaked in the habit of a monk, he would be removed from the tangled dramas of court life, his desire suppressed under the discipline of prayer and labor. To refuse was unthinkable. Families wielded both sword and scripture to enforce obedience. Fathers, brothers, and bishops united in the cause of preserving lineage and order. The second son, torn between duty and love, had little choice but to submit. His future was traded for a lifetime behind stone walls, chanting prayers that echoed the loss of his freedom, his passion, and his identity. Life in the monastery was harsh and isolating. The vows he took, poverty, chastity, obedience, were not only spiritual commitments, but a lifelong sentence. The days blurred into one another. Dawn prayers, manual labor, silent meals, letters from home ceased or came only with strict censorship. The world he knew, the woman he loved, became distant memories, fading like shadows at dusk. Yet, even in exile, the second son's story rippled outward. Court gossip whispered of scandal and heartbreak, of a brother sacrificed not to war or ransom, but to the cruel demands of blood and honor. The noblewoman, meanwhile, married the elder brother, her hand and her life pledged in us a union as cold as the marble walls that now confined her lover. This fate was not unique. Across medieval Europe, monasteries served as convenient prisons for younger sons whose ambitions or affections threatened the family order. The church, complicit or willing, provided sanctuary and exile in one. Many such men entered religious life under duress, their vows less a calling and more a sentence imposed by circumstance. Some found solace in faith, some rebelled in secret, and others disappeared into history's margins, forgotten, erased, as if their hearts had been locked away forever with them. Their stories remind us that medieval love was rarely free, often painful, and deeply political. The exile of a second son for forbidden love reveals a world where family loyalty demanded sacrifice, where inheritance dictated destiny, and where personal happiness was the cost of preserving power. It is a tale of heartbreak, duty, and the merciless limits placed on those born to be second. In the shadowed corners of noble courts, behind the pomp of feasts and tournaments, lives like his unfolded, quiet tragedies that shape the fabric of history far more than the battles or treaties remembered. The second son, who loved and lost, was not merely a victim of family ambition, but a symbol of the human cause hidden beneath the pageantry of medieval life. And though his name may be lost, the echo of his exile lingers, a haunting reminder that in the medieval world, love was often a luxury only the firstborn could afford. The knight who died. Unknown. Picture a medieval battlefield, mud-soaked, churned by the hooves of armored horses, littered with shattered shields and splintered lances. Banners flutter violently in the smoke-filled air, emblazoned with family crests. Among the chaos, warriors fight fiercely, driven by honor, duty, or sheer survival. Many will never return home, but among these fallen heroes, countless brave knights will vanish, not only in death, but from memory itself. They will leave no trace of their courage, their sacrifice, or even their names. They were the second sons, the younger brothers of heirs whose lives were defined by being forever second, forever forgotten. Historical records of medieval warfare often reveal a haunting truth. The deeds of second sons were rarely recorded. Battles meticulously chronicle the triumphs and tragedies of noble houses, preserving forever the name and legacy of the eldest son, the one who would inherit land, power, and glory. But when historians look closer into the margins and footnotes, they find a chilling pattern. Beside the heir's name, another entry appears quietly, almost as an afterthought, simply "and brother." In countless manuscripts, muster rolls, and chronicles, you find these ghostly words repeated endlessly. Lord Geoffrey of Lancaster fought bravely and fell heroically alongside his brother. Or, Count Raymond led the charge, accompanied by his younger brother, who perished in the battle. No name, no detail, no epitaph, just "and brother." These knights, who rode onto the field with courage, who risked everything for family and honor, become lost to history, remembered only as shadows of the heirs they followed. To be a second son meant living under a shadow cast by your elder brother, a shadow that stretched across every aspect of life. From the moment you were born, your identity was defined by what you were not. Not heir, not lord, not leader. Instead, you became support, a loyal servant to the house name, your life's value measured only by how well you could defend your brother's legacy. In war, these younger sons took the most perilous risks, charging bravely into enemy lines, shielding their brothers from harm, knowing they would never be celebrated for their sacrifice. They fought in battles where victory brought glory to the eldest, and defeat brought anonymity or death. Yet they fought anyway, driven by loyalty, pride, and a desperate hope to carve out even the smallest legacy of their own. But for most, recognition never came. When battles ended and chronicles were written, second sons disappeared into silence. Clerks writing records did not think their names worthy of ink. Historians would later dismiss them as unimportant. Noble families memorialize only their firstborn, the one who would inherit castles, lands, and legends. The second son's bravery, often equally remarkable or even more heroic, faded away like smoke on a battlefield breeze. Take, for example, the Battle of Crécy in 1346, a pivotal moment in the 100 Years' War. Detailed chronicles record the bravery of English and French knights. The eldest sons of powerful families were immortalized, their courage and sacrifice retold for generations. But read carefully, and you'll find countless entries like John, Lord of Ashbury, fought gallantly alongside his brother, and nothing more. No first name, no personal story, just a faceless figure who rode valiantly into death. His bravery reduced to a footnote, his very existence summarized as an attachment to someone else's heroism. In medieval England, France, and across Europe, thousands of second sons died unnamed, their bravery unwritten, their valor remembered only by those who loved them. Their lives were reduced to tools, expendable instruments serving the ambitions of family and tradition. Yet these forgotten men were often the truest knights, those who rode bravely into impossible odds, fighting fiercely to defend a legacy they would never share. Their sacrifices paved the way for the firstborn sons who survived, inherited, and whose names echo through history, stained glass windows, and heraldic scrolls. These forgotten knight stories are only glimpsed through scattered evidence, fragments of armor etched with unnamed crests, letters from grieving mothers preserved in family archives, forgotten tombstones that simply read, "Here lies a brave knight," with no further identity. Their voices are lost to history, silenced beneath layers of dust and neglect. Yet, if you walk quietly through medieval cemeteries, castle chapels, and forgotten battlefields, you might still sense their presence, warriors who lived nobly, fought bravely, and vanished without acknowledgement, reduced by history to little more than shadows behind their elder siblings. Modern historians now strive to recover these lost stories, piecing together fragments of evidence, reconstructing forgotten lives. Slowly, the "and brother" begins to take shape again, a young knight, perhaps hopeful or fearful, whose armor shone briefly in battle, whose courage might have matched or exceeded his more famous sibling. Today, we pause and wonder about them, men who sacrificed everything, knowing they might never be named, never be praised, never be mourned beyond their family circle. Their anonymity carries profound sorrow. Consider the pain of mothers and sisters who waited for news, who mourned quietly in private chambers, whose grief remained hidden, overshadowed by celebrations for the surviving heir. Think of the brother who lived, haunted by memories of courage he could not publicly honor, who saw his younger sibling buried hastily on foreign soil, remembered only in private prayer. This tragedy is not limited to medieval Europe. Throughout history, younger siblings have been overlooked, overshadowed, and forgotten in the grand narratives crafted by powerful families. But in the brutal and glorious landscape of medieval warfare, this erasure was especially stark and poignant. A life given freely, bravery offered without hope of reward, death accepted without recognition, and yet perhaps their nobility lies precisely here, in the giving everything despite knowing they might be forgotten, in fighting bravely despite history's silence. The knight who died unknown represents a purity of valor, courage without expectation of glory, sacrifice without hope of remembrance. So as we explore history, reading chronicles and studying battles, we must pause when we encounter that haunting phrase, "and brother," and remember that behind it was a human life, brave, loyal, deserving of honor. Even if we cannot fully recover their names or their stories, we can acknowledge their existence, their courage, and their sacrifice. We remember them now, the knights who vanished in silence, whose bravery went unrecorded, whose sacrifice became just a whisper behind another's legend. History may not have honored them, but today, in this quiet moment, we do. Trained from birth to serve the eldest, in the elegant halls of the medieval estates, where candlelight Tinian flickered softly against polished armor and gilded portraits, a stark and unyielding truth ruled every household. Firstborn sons inherited destiny, second sons inherited duty. From their earliest days, younger brothers were reminded relentlessly that their lives had one overriding purpose: to support, protect, and serve the eldest son, the heir to titles, wealth, and legacy. Their dreams, hopes, and ambitions were not considered. They were born, quite simply, to be shadows, echoes, and shields. Imagine the weight of being taught from childhood that your value lies not in your own identity or desires, but in your unwavering devotion to someone else. Tutors in medieval Europe drilled this lesson into second sons with relentless precision, while the eldest child studied languages, diplomacy, law, and the finer points of statecraft. Younger brothers received a different education entirely. They learned warfare, not to lead armies, but to protect the one who would. They studied loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice, not because these virtues were noble in themselves, but because they ensured the survival and glory of the heir. Historical records from the great courts of France, England, Spain, and Italy reveal a startlingly consistent pattern. In these noble houses, tutors and mentors openly reminded younger sons of their subordinate status. Chroniclers noted bitter lessons, stark admonitions that lingered in young minds. "Your sword serves your brother's crown," or "Your honor is bound to his name." Such phrases were repeated so often they became internalized truths, shaping the very identity of the second son. Their education, deliberately inferior, emphasized martial prowess over intellectual cultivation. Younger sons were taught to fight, to ride, and to command men only in battle, not to govern or rule, while firstborn sons sat with scholars, poring over manuscripts and maps. Second sons sparred with masters at arms, drilled until exhaustion hardened for combat. Tutors believed too much knowledge or ambition could breed resentment. A second son's role was to accept without question, to obey without doubt, and, if necessary, to die without protest. For these children, childhood itself was limited and fleeting. By age 7, a second son's play became training. His games were replaced by sword drills and archery practice. Boys as young as 10 or 11 were often sent away to serve as pages or squires, not just for education, but to reinforce their subordinate place in the social order. Letters home from tutors, often harshly critical, described their charges as stubborn or defiant when they showed even a hint of independent thought. Obedience was praised above all else. The perfect second son was not one who excelled, but one who never questioned. Psychologically, the impact of such training was profound. Being raised with the constant message that your worth lies entirely in someone else's shadow breeds a unique bitterness, a quiet anger that history rarely acknowledges. Diaries and private letters from second sons, rare glimpses into their true feelings, sometimes reveal deep sadness hidden beneath formal obedience. Many felt invisible, trapped in life scripted before birth. They struggled privately with feelings of inadequacy, haunted by the knowledge that they were seen as replaceable, useful only in service to their elder sibling. Yet, paradoxically, many second sons became fiercely loyal. Having internalized the idea of their subordination, they devoted their lives wholeheartedly to the family cause, defending their brothers even at great personal risk. Chronicles from the Hundred Years' War and the Wars of the Roses speak repeatedly of second sons fighting with reckless courage, not because they expected glory, but because loyalty had been so ingrained that it became their primary identity. Their bravery was legendary, but rarely rewarded. They fought not for themselves, but for another's legacy, often dying in obscurity. There were exceptions, of course. Some second sons rebelled against this rigid fate, rejecting their prescribed roles. They became mercenaries, adventurers, or joined the clergy to seek power elsewhere. Occasionally, they challenged their elder brothers directly, leading to infamous family feuds and even civil wars. History remembers names like Richard the Lionheart's brother, John, himself a younger sibling whose entire life was shaped by rivalry and resentment. Such examples, though dramatic, were the exception rather than the rule. Most second sons remained obediently in the shadows. This practice extended across all noble classes, not just royalty. Even among minor nobility and wealthy merchant families, second sons were raised with the same relentless instruction. Their childhood dreams of becoming knights, lords, or heroes were carefully redirected into pragmatic roles. Captains of guards, estate managers, minor officials, or household protectors. Their education, deliberately limited, ensured they would never become a threat to their older brother's power. They could aspire to heroism only within the carefully constructed framework of service. In some tragic cases, these second sons never fully escaped the shadow cast over their childhood. Surviving records describe men who remained painfully aware that their potential was deliberately stifled. Some became withdrawn, embittered, or cruel, taking out their frustrations on servants, retainers, or enemies. Others struggled their entire lives, haunted by feelings of inadequacy or inferiority. A few found quiet satisfaction in their roles, genuinely devoted to their brothers, deriving pride from sacrifice. But beneath the surface, each second son faced the same core struggle, knowing their life was not their own. Historically, this custom made practical sense to noble families. Clearly defined roles prevented disputes over inheritance, and younger sons trained for military service could defend family estates from rivals. Yet, practicality offered little comfort to the boys raised under this system. Psychological studies today illuminate how profoundly damaging it is to live with a constant awareness that one's purpose is defined solely by another's needs. Anxiety, insecurity, and self-doubt were common legacies for second sons. Their lives reveal a profound, uncomfortable truth about history and human nature. In the name of stability, tradition, and family honor, medieval society willingly sacrificed the individuality, dreams, and happiness of countless young men. The second son's role was not just a personal tragedy, it was a societal acceptance of inequality as necessary and natural. Yet, Perhaps the most powerful legacy these second sons left behind is their silent courage. Many never found their way into history books. They left no grand estates, no lasting monuments, but their quiet struggles, their painful loyalty, their unspoken grief helped shape kingdoms, kept dynasties alive, and secured legacies they themselves would never share. In the echoes of their hidden stories, history reminds us how easily individuals can become lost within traditions, and how essential it is to remember not just the great names, but those whose lives were sacrificed, shaped, and quietly erased, all to serve someone else's destiny. Younger sons were often sent to die in duels. In the ancient stone halls of noble Europe, honor was not just a word, it was the law, the very air a family breathed. It could shape alliances, rewrite history, and decide who lived and who died. But in this ruthless world, who bore the true cost of family pride? Not the firstborn heir, sheltered behind the castle walls and shielded by privilege. No, the burden of honor fell heavily, brutally, upon the shoulders of the second son. He became the family's chosen champion in affairs of pride and scandal, a pawn sent forth to duel with the odds stacked cruelly against him. Imagine, for a moment, the silent halls of a medieval manor. A letter arrives at dawn, an insult, a challenge, perhaps a scandalous accusation. The family gathers. The lord, his expression hardened by years of pride, weighs the risk. His eldest son, the heir to titles, wealth, and legacy, sits quietly, confident, certain of his safety. Beside him, the younger son waits, his breath slow, his eyes lowered. He knows the decision already, though he still hopes, faintly, foolishly, that this time might be different. But tradition never bends, and fate rarely softens. The second son will be sent to fight, to risk everything for a cause that is barely his own. He is trained from childhood to duel, to handle blades and pistols with deadly skill. But he fights not for personal glory or justice, nor even vengeance. He fights simply because his life, in the eyes of his family, is expendable. Valuable, yes, but only as a shield for the heir, as a sacrifice on the altar of honor. Historically, duels were never trivial. A single insult could ripple across kingdoms, shaking alliances and threatening stability. Nobility viewed honor as sacred, something tangible and blood-bound. To let a challenge pass unanswered was weakness, but to risk the heir, the very embodiment of the family's future, was unthinkable. Thus, the younger son became the solution, a brave face, a willing sword, a life that could be lost without catastrophe. From the archives of France to the chronicles of England, the stories are brutally consistent. Younger sons fought in muddy fields at dawn, pistols loaded and blades sharpened, while their older brothers waited safely behind castle walls. Each duel was a lottery of death. To lose meant to fall to cold earth, forgotten in disgrace. But even victory was cruel. Winning meant killing a rival noble's champion, perhaps igniting blood feuds that would force exile. No family would shelter a second son who drew powerful enemies. His reward was banishment, sent away to wander as a fugitive hero, celebrated in whispers but unwelcome at home. Consider the psychological torment of these young men. From boyhood, they knew their purpose was to guard another's life with their own. Their tutors taught them discipline, courage, and skill, but also taught them never to question their role. They lived in shadow, beloved only when necessary, praised only after death. History records duels fought between brothers from rival houses, second sons, once childhood friends, sent to face each other in mortal combat for the sake of family honor. Their eyes would meet over swords drawn not from hatred, but obedience, bound by a loyalty neither chose. One documented case from 16th century Italy tells of a noble family whose heir was accused of dishonoring another house's daughter. The insult demanded blood. The younger son was chosen as champion, armed and sent to fight the offended party's second son, a childhood friend. The duel lasted mere minutes. The family's younger son, victorious but shattered, returned to silence, shame, and eventually exile, his heart forever scarred by killing a man he once called brother. He had protected the family name, but lost himself. In France, countless younger sons fought duels on behalf of kings, princes, and brothers who refused to dirty their hands. Many died quietly, in fields at dawn, their bodies carried away discreetly, names rarely recorded. Those who survived wandered the continent, never able to return home without risking death from enemies or indifference from family. Their skill with blade and pistol made them prize mercenaries, their tragic stories becoming songs sung in taverns, cautionary tales whispered among nobles. Why did families maintain such cruel traditions? Because power and inheritance depended on preserving a perfect lineage, untouched by scandal, injury, or public defeat. To shield the heir was to shield the family's very future. To secure political stability, a second son was a sacrificial figure, brave, tragic, endlessly useful. He knew he would never inherit, never lead, never rule. His worth was measured only in bravery, obedience, and silent willingness to die if necessary. Yet, even in death, second sons rarely earned true honor. If they fell in combat, their bodies were discreetly buried, their names vanished from official histories, the family moving quickly past the scandal. Honor preserved, shame buried, life continued as if nothing had happened. The victorious second sons faced a worse fate, life as exiles, forbidden to return home, forced to find meaning far from the castles they had protected. They drifted across battlefields, living as mercenaries, their swords always sharpened, their hearts always empty. Such duels left a lasting mark on European culture. Honor killings persisted for centuries, shaped by this brutal logic. Even today, we speak of honor as something worth dying for, rarely pausing to wonder whose death paid that price. The second son, forever overlooked, forever loyal, was the hidden foundation of a system that prized honor above humanity, status above survival. Imagine standing alone in that misty field at dawn, the air cold and sharp, your opponent silhouetted against the rising sun. Imagine knowing your life is valued only so far as it protects your brothers. Imagine winning and knowing victory will rob you of home, family, and future. Imagine losing and knowing no one will mourn too deeply or remember too long. This was the cruel reality faced by younger sons of noble houses, their honor, their courage, their lives offered up willingly, yet never truly theirs. Their legacy lives in forgotten graves, in names erased from records, in the silence of castles that survived only because one man was brave enough to die or cursed enough to live in exile. Their story is the dark truth behind every noble lineage, a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage is to fight for a family that loves you only when honor demands your life. Denied burial in family tombs. In medieval Europe, death was as much a matter of legacy as life. The grand family crypt beneath the stone floors of ancestral halls was not merely a resting place. It was a sacred symbol of lineage, power, and eternal remembrance. To be buried there was to secure one's place in the family's unbroken chain, a guarantee that your name would echo in generations to come. But this honor was reserved for the heir, the firstborn son who inherited title, land, and legacy. For the second sons, the story of death was often one of exclusion, anonymity, and erasure. Imagine the final journey of a nobleman, not as a triumphant procession into hallowed family grounds, but as a quiet, overlooked burial at the edge of a chapel's yard or in a shallow, unmarked grave. The tombs that held your ancestors, adorned with carved effigies and heraldic symbols, were close to you. Your name was stripped from stone and memory alike. This was the grim reality for many second sons, those born noble but denied the dignity of a family crypt. The reasons were rooted in law and tradition. Medieval inheritance laws, particularly primogeniture, dictated more than just the transfer of property. They controlled the entire framework of noble identity. Being excluded from the family tomb was a reflection of exclusion from the family legacy. The firstborn was the lord, the rightful bearer of the family name, and thus entitled to eternal honor and remembrance. Younger sons, regardless of their deeds or loyalty, were cast aside even in death, marked as lesser branches of the family tree. This denial of burial rites was more than symbolic. It reflected the social realities of the time, the pinch of the consolidation of wealth, power, and memory into a single line. Funerary customs enforced this hierarchy with brutal clarity. The family crypt was a closed world, its stones inscribed with proud names and dates, its air heavy with incense and whispered prayers for the heir's soul. To be excluded was to be forgotten. Historical records reveal heart-wrenching details of these burials. Parish registers show entries for nobles buried without honor or in the churchyard, terms that thinly veil their exclusion. Some second sons were interred in side chapels reserved for servants or minor nobility, places where their noble blood was acknowledged only with reluctance. Others disappeared into unmarked graves, their resting places lost beneath centuries of grass and soil, erased from the narrative of the family and community. The psychological impact of such exclusion was profound, resonating beyond death. For the second son, who lived a life of quiet sacrifice, managing estates, serving in battle, or entering the church, to be denied a place in the family crypt was a final rejection, a denial of belonging, a severing of ties that had defined their identity. It was a message to the living and the dead alike. You were never truly one of us. In some rare instances, second sons sought alternative burial sites, monasteries where they had served, foreign churches where they had fought, or even humble graves marked only by simple crosses. These places became their chosen sanctuaries, spaces where memory could exist outside the shadow of inheritance laws. Yet, such exceptions were rare, often the result of personal piety or external patronage rather than family acceptance. The denial of burial rites also reinforced societal divisions. The family tomb was not only a place of remembrance, but a public assertion of power. The exclusion of second sons from these sacred spaces underscored their diminished status, reminding all who entered the chapel who truly belonged. Visitors and vassals knew that beneath the stone lay the rightful rulers, while those denied entrance were shadows on the margins. Over time, as inheritance laws softened and social structures evolved, the strictness of burial practices relaxed. More families began to commemorate all their children, and churchyards welcomed those once excluded. But for centuries, the story of second sons was one of invisibility even in death, a legacy of exclusion that echoes through history. So when you walk past ancient family chapels, when you see the proud effigies of lords and ladies carved in stone, remember those who rest elsewhere. the second sons laid to rest without titles, without monuments, in unmarked graves or forgotten corners of sacred grounds. Their absence is a silent testament to a world where birthright ruled not only life but death itself. They were denied the honor of the crypt, but their stories remain buried in history's shadows, waiting to be uncovered, remembered, and reclaimed. The brother who became a pirate. In the rigid world of medieval and early modern Europe, birth order defined destiny. The firstborn son inherited lands, titles, and the future of the family. The second son, often left adrift, without land, purpose, or hope for real power. This is the story of one such second son, a man pushed to the edges of society, who chose a path far darker than obedience or exile. He became a pirate, preying on the very ships that served the kingdom his family once proudly represented. His tale is one of desperation, rebellion, and ultimate oblivion. Born into a noble house, steeped in tradition and duty, he was the spare, neither hated nor cherished, simply surplus. While his elder brother was groomed for lordship, diplomacy, and honor, he was left with empty promises and fading expectations. The family estate, the family name, the family future, all reserved for the heir. For the younger son, there was little beyond a life of waiting, servitude, or exile. His refusal to accept this fate shocked his family. Offered minor clerical roles, modest military posts, even distant land grants with little value, he declined each with growing bitterness. "Why should I serve when I have no kingdom to rule?" he reportedly asked, his voice heavy with resentment. His disobedience was not just youthful defiance, it was a refusal to be forgotten. Isolated and without a clear future, he found himself drawn to the sea, a place of freedom, danger, and opportunity. The open water offered a grim answer to his hollow prospects on land. There, laws were thin, loyalties shifting, and fortunes could be won or lost in a single battle. He became a pirate, not the romanticized figure of legend, but a ruthless outlaw, striking at merchant ships and naval vessels alike. His targets were no accident. Many were the ships of the very nation his family had served for generations. He turned against the crown that had denied him, against the society that had cast him aside. Each raid was a blow not only to commerce, but to the honor of his house. His name, whispered among sailors and merchants, became synonymous with betrayal. Piracy in those times was brutal. It was not just theft, but violence, fear, and sometimes murder. Life aboard a pirate ship was harsh, governed by its own strict codes and brutal discipline. Yet, it was a democracy of desperation, where even a second son could command if he proved cunning and courage. He rose quickly through the ranks, gaining respect and fear in equal measure. The crown, unable to tolerate such open defiance, launched relentless campaigns to capture him. His exploits were chronicled in reports sent to royal courts, casting him as a traitor and menace. Yet his identity remained a secret, shielded by the shifting allegiances of pirate crews and coastal sympathizers. Eventually, betrayal came, not from a naval fleet, but from within. A crewmate sold him out for gold and pardon. Captured and brought before a court, his noble lineage was stripped from him, his crimes deemed unforgivable. Executed anonymously, his body was disposed of far from home, leaving no grave, no epitaph. The family's official records made no mention of him. To them, he was a stain, an embarrassment to be erased, a second son who chose rebellion over duty and paid with oblivion. His story, while lost to formal history, survives in the shadows, an unspoken reminder of the cause of rigid social order and the human desperation born from rejection. Through his story, we glimpse the hidden fractures beneath the noble facade, the lives broken by inheritance laws that left many to choose exile, rebellion, or death. The brother who became a pirate is not merely a cautionary tale, but a testament to a world where the cost of being second was sometimes a descent into darkness, and though his name vanished, his legacy sails on the turbulent seas of history, an outlaw who dared to reject a destiny written for him and carved his own, however grim, upon the waves. Mocked by nobility, ignored by commoners. Imagine walking into a crowded medieval hall filled with the murmur of voices and the gleam of candlelight reflected on silver goblets. Noblemen gather around, each proudly announcing his lineage, his lands, his titles. Yet, as you enter, voices drop, smiles become smirks, and eyes glance away dismissively. You are recognized, but barely acknowledged. You carry noble blood, but no title. You are born of power, but possess none yourself. You exist on the borderlands of status, forever caught between greatness and invisibility. You are a second son. Throughout the Middle Ages, inheritance laws shaped lives ruthlessly. Primogeniture, where all property and titles passed only to the eldest son, created a class of noble children left stranded without identity or future. For second sons, status was ambiguous. Born into privilege, but denied its benefits, they often wandered aimlessly between the world of nobility and the reality of ordinary people. Nobles mocked them openly. Without land or titles, second sons were viewed as burdens, threats, or merely pathetic shadows of their more fortunate brothers. They attended feasts in borrowed finery, forced to laugh at jokes aimed subtly or not so subtly at their own lack of inheritance. Noble ladies politely turned their eyes away, knowing they could not marry a man without fortune or land. Fathers spoke of them dismissively in council meetings, and elder brothers made it clear they were tolerated, not needed. The great halls and castles became arenas of quiet humiliation. But if noble life was cruel, life among commoners was equally harsh. Peasants and tradespeople saw second sons as the strange anomalies, men whose delicate hands had never truly worked the fields, whose polished manners seemed arrogant or frivolous, whose education was useless outside the castles and monasteries. Commoners rarely welcomed them warmly. In taverns, marketplaces, and villages, second sons faced suspicion or mockery. They spoke too softly, carried themselves with too much pride, and their presence felt like a constant intrusion into lives defined by hard labor and practical skills. The result was constant confusion and isolation. Second sons lived without belonging, too noble for peasants, too powerless for lords. This uncertain existence tore at their identities, leaving deep psychological wounds. Many felt trapped, forever condemned to drift, unwelcome in both worlds. Historians find countless letters and journals from medieval times filled with second sons' quiet despair, men who felt themselves failures before their lives even truly began. Take, for instance, Thomas, a second son of a minor English lord, both recorded in a 14th century diary. He wrote bitterly of attending courtly gatherings where he was openly mocked as Lord Nobody, forced to laugh at jokes aimed squarely at himself. Thomas wandered from village to village, attempting unsuccessfully to join a trade. Peasants mistrusted him, seeing only his noble manners, his fine speech, and his unfamiliarity with labor. He eventually took minor church vows, not from devotion, but desperation, writing sadly that it was the only place he could live without ridicule. Or consider Henri, a second son from 13th century France. Raised in privilege, educated in Latin and knightly courtesy, he was sent away by his father at 15, stripped of any chance at inheritance. His elder brother inherited vast estates, castles, and respect. Henri wandered alone, mocked at noble courts for his lack of land or title, laughed at in villages for his inability to till fields or work a forge. He eventually became a mercenary soldier, drifting from war to war, never truly belonging anywhere, never truly respected. These examples were not rare exceptions, but the quiet norm. Second sons were constant victims of medieval society's brutal hierarchy. Their ambiguous social position was more than humiliating. It was psychologically destructive. Historians now recognize that many second sons likely suffered profound isolation and emotional pain, yet medieval society offered no compassion for such suffering. Nobility expected them to remain silently grateful for their privileged births, while commoners resented their presence. Some second sons sought redemption through violence, becoming knights, crusaders, or soldiers for hire, desperately attempting to prove their worth on battlefields. Others entered the clergy, losing their identities to monastic routines, burying themselves in prayers, manuscripts, and solitude. Many simply vanished into history's margins. Wanderers, beggars, forgotten men whose lives ended unnoticed, without fame or even pity. The suffering was institutionalized by inheritance laws that recognized only the eldest son. Primogeniture offered stability to noble families, but crushed second sons beneath its weight. Families often justified their harsh treatment with the cold logic of survival. Estates could not be divided. Titles could not be diluted. Second sons became collateral damage, lives sacrificed to ensure the stability of power, and so they drifted endlessly between rejection and indifference. Noble lords saw them as failures, common people viewed them with suspicion, and even their own families considered them expendable. It's difficult to imagine the loneliness and confusion these young men endured, the constant humiliation, the quiet desperation of never belonging. The stories of second sons teach us much about the medieval society's brutal heart, where human dignity was secondary to tradition, where family bonds fractured under inheritance laws, and where personal happiness was rarely considered. But perhaps there is dignity even in these forgotten stories of men who, despite humiliation and confusion, survived, endured, and searched desperately for purpose in a world built to erase them. Their voices echo faintly now, preserved in quiet records, diaries, letters, and chronicles, words written in loneliness and frustration, hoping someone might someday understand their plight. In hearing them now, we remember lives defined not by privilege or power, but by quiet strength and resilience in the face of cruelty and rejection. Today, we recognize these forgotten second sons, not for glory, not for power, but for their humanity. Their lives remind us that true nobility is not measured by titles or lands, but by how we treat those most vulnerable and powerless among us. These men, mocked by nobles, ignored by commoners, never found belonging, but their stories compel us, centuries later, to grant them at last the dignity and respect their own age refused them.